It's late. I'm glad you're here. I'm Tim. If you're new, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Whatever you were carrying today, you can set it down at the door. It'll still be there in the morning if you want it back. 4 stories tonight. The first is about an overnight 911 dispatcher in a small county in Nebraska, and about a call she takes at 2:34 in the morning from a woman at an address that has been an abandoned farmstead since the house burned down in 2013. The second is about the captain of a small winter ferry running out to an island off the coast of Maine, and about a new mate he takes on in February, and about a passenger who has been riding the ferry once every 3 years or so, for as long as anyone can remember. The third is about an amateur radio operator in a small town in Montana, alone in his house since his wife died, and about the signal he starts to pick up at 3:47 in the morning on a frequency that no one is supposed to be broadcasting on. The fourth is about a cave surveyor working alone in the karst country of southern Indiana, and about a chamber he finds on the 3rd day of a solo survey trip that has been sealed off from the rest of the cave for at least 10,000 years, and about the decision he has to make when he gets to it. Long ones. Tonight. The kind you settle into. You don't have to keep up. You don't have to remember any of it in the morning. If your eyes get heavy in the middle of one, that's the whole point. I'll keep talking. You'll drift. The stories will keep going. A like helps another tired person find their way here on some long night. A subscribe brings me back to you on the next one. So settle in. Pull the blanket up. Let the day fall away. Take a slow breath in and a slower one out. When you're ready, we'll begin. Sheila Marsden was 39 years old and had been a 911 dispatcher for the Kearney County Sheriff's Office in Minden, Nebraska, for 11 years. And on the 3rd Tuesday of October, 2026, at exactly 2:34 in the morning, the call came in. She had been on shift since 10. The comm center at the Kearney County Justice Center was on the 2nd floor of the building on West 9th Street in Minden, above the sheriff's office and the county jail. It was a low-lit room with 2 paired workstations along the west wall and a wall of windows on the east side that looked out onto the parking lot and the fields beyond. The windows were the reason Sheila liked the room. From her workstation she could see, on clear nights, the glow of Minden Small downtown to the north, and beyond that, the dark of the Nebraska plain running away to the horizon. And above the dark, the field of stars that a person could still see over a small county on a clear night in October. She had been at the workstation since 10:05. Her partner that night was Devin Prust. He was 28. He had been a dispatcher for the sheriff's office for 19 months. He had come to the job from a call center in Grand Island, where he had worked customer service for a wireless carrier for 3 years after community college, and he had, in the 19 months since, developed the quiet competence that Sheila valued in a partner. He did not talk much on shift. He did not check his phone. He did not eat noisy food. He came in with a thermos of coffee and a book, and between calls he read, and when the calls came in, he took them cleanly and moved on. Sheila had trained him. Sheila had been the one who trained new dispatchers at the sheriff's office for the last 6 years. She had trained 4 of them. 3 had stayed. Devin was one of the 3. Sheila was, on the reckoning of the sheriff's office, the person you wanted training your new dispatchers, because she was patient and thorough, and because she had, in her 11 years, been through most of what a dispatcher in a rural county could be through. She had, in those 11 years, taken calls from women who were being beaten by their husbands. She had taken calls from men who had shot themselves with hunting rifles and were bleeding out on their kitchen floors. She had taken calls from children who had watched their parents die of overdoses. She had taken calls from truckers who had rolled their rigs on I-80 and were pinned to their cabs and knew they were going to burn. She had taken calls from mothers whose children had wandered off in cornfields in July and would be found by search parties the next morning under a willow tree on the bank of the Platte. She had taken most of what there was to take. She was on the reckoning of a woman who had done the work for 11 years, good at it. The shift had been quiet. She had taken 6 calls between 10 and 2. 3 were medical. 1 for a chest pain call at a farmhouse east of town, an elderly man named Werner Lundin, whose wife had called it in, and who was, when the M's got there, having what turned out to be indigestion. 1 for an elderly woman who had fallen out of bed at the assisted living facility on Brown Street, a facility Sela knew well because she took calls from it once or twice a week. And the woman was a resident named Ilse Tordvik, who Sela had spoken with by phone many times over the years, and who would be all right, the intake nurse said, just shaken up. 1 for a diabetic reaction at a house on the north edge of town, a young mother whose glucose had dropped and who had been able to give herself glucagon before the M's arrived. 2 were welfare checks, a woman in Axtell whose sister had not returned her calls in 2 days. The deputy had found the sister at home, in her nightgown at 10:30 at night, asleep in front of the television. A man in Wilcox, whose neighbor had not seen him for a week, the deputy had found him sitting on his porch in the dark, drinking a beer, saying he had been fine and just had not wanted to talk to anyone. The last was a noise complaint, a pickup truck racing on the county road out toward Wilcox at 11:45 in the evening. The deputy had gone out. The truck had been gone by the time he got there. Devon had taken 4 calls in the same window. All routine. A minor traffic accident on Highway 6 with no injuries. A domestic complaint that turned out to be a shouting match between a couple in a mobile home park on the west side of town who had settled down by the time the deputy arrived. A report of a raccoon in a garage. A report of a stray dog on Highway 74. By 2, the county had settled into the quiet it settled into in the small hours on a Tuesday in October. The deputies on patrol were driving slow loops through their zones. The radio traffic between deputies was minimal. Devon had, at about 1:30, gone to the small kitchen off the comm center to refill his coffee, and had brought Sela a mug of hers, and had returned to his workstation, and had opened his book, and had settled in. Sela had been thinking, at 2:30, about her cat. Her cat was an old orange tomcat named Wooly, who she had adopted from the animal shelter in Kearney 6 years ago. Wooly was, on the reckoning of the veterinarian, about 15. He had been having trouble getting up on the bed the last few weeks. Sela had been thinking about whether to buy him a set of small carpeted steps from the pet supply store on 4th Street, or whether to build them herself out of the scrap plywood she had in her utility closet. She was, at 2:34, thinking about the plywood. Her line rang. She keyed her headset. She said, 911. What is the address of your emergency? There was a pause on the line. Then a woman's voice said, Please, Sela said, ma'am. Can you tell me your address? The woman said, Please, it is in my house. Sela said, ma'am. Take a breath. I need your address. The woman said, 4832 County Road F. Sela typed the address into her CAD system. The system searched. It came back with the address highlighted red. Sela glanced at the flag. The flag was a coding note. It read, premises vacant, structure burned 2013. No current occupancy. No functional utilities. Sheila looked at the flag for a moment. She said, "Ma'am, what is your name?" The woman said, "Adeline Ostrand." Sheila typed the name. The system returned a record. A resident with that name had been at the address until March of 2013. Sheila said, "Ma'am, I need to ask you again. What is the address you are calling from?" The woman said, 4832 County Road F. "Please, it is in my house. I am in the pantry." Sheila said, "Ma'am, I have you on the line. I am sending help. Stay on with me. Can you tell me what is in the house?" The woman said, "It is walking. It is in the kitchen." Sheila said to Devon, without taking her mic off, "Devon, I have a female caller reporting an intruder at 4832 County Road F. The system flags the address as a vacant burned structure, but the phone number is coming up on my display as a landline at that address." Devon pulled up his own display. He said the line was disconnected in 2013 per utility records. Sheila said, "But I have her on it." Devon said, "You do." Sheila said, "Dispatch Yale." Devon said, "Dispatching Yale." Devon keyed his radio. He said, "Kearney 32, Kearney Com. Deputy Marcus Yale, 31, on patrol in a Ford Explorer somewhere on Highway 74 south of Minden." Keyed back. He said, "Kearney Com, Kearney 32, go." Devon said, "Kearney 32, I need you to respond to 4832, County Road F, female caller reporting intruder in the residence. Note that the residence is flagged as a vacant burn structure. Approach with caution." Marcus said, "Kearney 32 responding. County Road F, 4832. Copy the flag. ETA approximately 22 minutes. Devon said, "Copy, 22 minutes. Sheila said into her headset, "Ma'am, Adeline, a deputy is on his way. He will be there in about 20 minutes. I am going to stay on the line with you. Tell me where you are in the house." Adeline said, "I am in the pantry. The pantry is next to the kitchen. The kitchen door is closed. I am under the shelves. It is in the kitchen." Sheila said, "How do you know it is in the kitchen?" Adeline said, "I can hear it." Sheila said, "What does it sound like?" Adeline said, "It is walking. It is walking on the linoleum. The linoleum is old. It creaks in the same places. My husband and I used to know the creaks. We used to know where the person was by the creaks. It is walking in the pattern of the creaks. It is by the sink now. It is by the refrigerator now. It is by the pantry door." Sheila's chest went cold. She said, "Adeline, listen to me. Stay quiet. Stay under the shelves. The deputy is on his way. Don't move. Don't make a sound." Adeline said, "It is at the pantry door." Sheila said, "Adeline, stay quiet." Adeline said, in a voice that had gone quieter, "It is not opening the door. It is standing on the other side of the door." Sheila said, "How do you know?" Adeline said, "I can feel it." Sheila said, Adeline said, "The floor is warm on the other side of the door." There was a long moment on the line. Sheila did not know what to say. She had been a dispatcher for 11 years. She had, in her training, been given every kind of protocol for every kind of call. There were protocols for callers with intruders in the house. There were protocols for callers who were injured. There were protocols for callers who were suicidal. There were protocols for callers who were confused, callers who were disoriented, callers who were on the verge of some kind of mental health episode. There was no protocol for a caller who had been dead for 13 years. She keyed her mic. She said, "Adeline, stay with me. Tell me about your house." Adeline said, "It is a 2-story frame house, white green shutters, a porch on the front, a porch on the back, a gravel driveway that goes up to the yard from County Road F. There's a windbreak of Russian olive trees along the north side of the yard. Errol planted them in '76, after the hard winter we had that year. Sheila said Errol. Adeline said Errol. My husband, Errol Ostrand. He was a hog farmer. Sheila said, how long were you married? Adeline said 39 years. We were married on the 11th of June, 1959. Errol died in '98. He was 71. He had a heart event in the barn on a Tuesday morning in November. I found him at 9:05 when I went out to see why he had not come in for his coffee. He was on his back by the big stall on the east side. His cap was off. I sat with him on the floor of the barn until the ambulance came. It took the ambulance 41 minutes to get out from Minden. I sat with him for 41 minutes on the floor of the barn. Sheila said, Adeline. Adeline said, I am with you. Sheila said, how long were you on the farm alone? Adeline said, 15 years. From '98 to the fire. Sheila stopped typing. She looked at her screen. She said, the fire. Adeline said, the fire was on the 17th of March, 2013. The house burned. I was in the house. Sheila said, Adeline. Adeline said, I know what you were thinking. Sheila said, Adeline, tell me your date of birth. Adeline said, March 14, 1938. Sheila typed the date of birth. Her CAD system returned the record. Adeline Marlene Ostrand, DOB 3/14/1938, deceased 3/17/2013. Cause of death asphyxiation due to structure fire. Decedent's remains recovered from residence at 4832 County Road F. Sheila looked at the screen. She looked over at Devon. Devon was looking at her. Sheila said to Devon, the caller says her name is Adeline Ostrand. Adeline Ostrand died in the fire at that residence in 2013. Devon said, Sheila. Sheila said, I know. Devon said, Sheila, this is a hoax call. Somebody has spoofed the number. Sheila said, maybe. Devon said, somebody thinks it's funny to call the county dispatch and pretend to be a dead woman. Sheila said, maybe. Devon said, but you don't think so. Sheila said, I don't know what I think. She keyed her mic. She said, Adeline. Adeline said, yes. Sheila said, Adeline, I need to ask you a difficult question. Adeline said, you want to know how I am on the phone? Sheila said, yes. Adeline said, I don't know. The phone is in the pantry. My husband put a phone in the pantry in 1988 because I liked to talk while I put up the tomatoes. It has always been there. It was there in the fire. It is here now. I picked it up. I dialed. You answered. Sheila said, Adeline. Adeline said, I am under the shelves. It is at the pantry door. I need help. Sheila said, the deputy is on his way. Adeline said, please hurry. They stayed on the line. For the next 14 minutes, Sheila kept her talking. She had Adeline describe the pantry. Adeline described the pantry. There were 3 walls of wooden shelves that Errol had built in the summer of 1962. The summer they had put in the vegetable garden that would feed them for the next 36 years. The shelves held her canning jars. She had, at the time of the fire, about 140-quart jars of tomatoes, 60 of green beans, 40 of peaches from her sister's orchard down in Kansas, 20 of pickled beets, and smaller jars of jam and jelly her mother-in-law had taught her to make in the 50s. She described the smell of the pantry, the smell of dry flour and cinnamon, and the mineral smell of the water from the well that had come up through the spring that fed their part of the county. She described the linoleum floor in the corner, where the water had come in one spring in the 80s and had warped the tile and had never been quite right again. She had Adeline talk about Errol. Adeline talked. She told Sheila about how she had met Errol at a dance at the American Legion in Holdredge in the summer of 1957, when she was 19 and he was 30, and she had been visiting an aunt for the summer from her home in Missouri. She told Selah about how Errol had asked her to dance 3 times that night and had walked her back to her aunt's house in the dark and had asked if he could call on her the next Sunday. She told Selah about how he had driven up the dirt drive in his father's old Ford pickup the next Sunday at 2, and how she had come out onto the porch to meet him, and how her aunt had watched from the kitchen window. She told Selah about the 2 years of Sundays before they were married. She told Selah about the wedding at the Lutheran church in Holdridge in the June of '59. She told Selah about the farm. She told Selah about their son, Verdon Ostrand. Verdon had been born in '62. He had grown up on the farm. He had gone to the Consolidated High School in Minden. He had gone to college at Kearney State. He had, in the '90s, moved to Omaha and had married a woman named Beleen and had gone to work for an insurance firm downtown. He had 2 children. He had, at the time of the fire, been living in Omaha for about 18 years. He had, since the fire, been living there for another 13. He was in his 60s now. Adeline had not seen him in 15 years. Adeline talked in the quiet way of a woman who was in a pantry with something on the other side of the pantry door and who had 13 years of things saved up to say and no one to say them to. Selah listened. She kept typing time-stamped notes in her CAD system. She noted every word Adeline said. She noted the time of every check-in from Deputy Yale on the radio. She noted, for herself, that her hands were cold and her mouth was dry, and that she had been a dispatcher for 11 years and had never, in all that time, felt what she was feeling now. The thing at the pantry door did not open the door. Adeline talked. Selah listened. At 2:56, the radio keyed. Marcus said, "Kearney Com, Kearney 32. Devon said, "Kearney 32. Go." Marcus said, "Kearney Com, I am on scene at 4832 County Road F. Advising the structure is boarded up. Windows are covered with plywood. Front door is padlocked from the outside. No lights. No signs of entry. No vehicle in the driveway. Grass has been unmowed for some years. This is a fully abandoned structure." Devon said, "Copy, Kearney 32. Please conduct a perimeter check." Marcus said, 10-4. "Conducting perimeter." Selah said into her headset, "Adeline, the deputy is at your house." Adeline said, "I know." Selah said, "You know." Adeline said, "I can hear him. He is at the front porch. He is trying the padlock." Selah said, "Adeline, he is going to walk around the house." Adeline said, "The thing at the pantry door has moved." Selah said, "Where has it gone?" Adeline said, "It is by the back door. It is watching him. It is watching him through the plywood." Selah keyed her radio. She said, "Kearney 32, Kearney Com. Be advised the caller is reporting that the intruder has moved to the back of the residence. Caller states the intruder is at the back door. Please be advised." Marcus said, "Copy, approaching the back." There was a long pause on the radio. Selah watched the wall clock over the door of the comm center. She watched the second hand go around the face. She watched Devon, who was watching her. She watched the glow of her CAD system on her workstation screen. She watched, out of the corner of her eye, the darkness of the parking lot beyond the wall of windows. Then Marcus said, "Kearney Com. Back door is padlocked from the outside as well. Windows are boarded. There's no one at the back of the residence. Perimeter is secure. Nothing here." Devon said, "Copy. Kearney 32. Selah said to Adeline, "The deputy is at the back of the house. He does not see anything." Adeline said, "It is right in front of him. It is standing on the other side of the plywood on the back kitchen window. It is looking at him." Selah said, Adeline said, He cannot see it. Sheila said, Adeline, the deputy is going to clear the scene. There is no active intruder that he can find. Adeline said, it is going to follow him. Sheila's throat went dry. She said, Adeline said, it is going to follow him to his car. Marcus keyed the radio. He said, Kearney Com, Kearney 32. I am clearing the scene. The structure is secure, and there is nothing to indicate any occupancy. Caller may be a hoax or a mental health situation. En route back to station. Devon said, copy Kearney 32. En route back to station. Sheila said into her headset, Adeline said, it is in the back of his car. Sheila said, Adeline said, it got into the back of his car when he opened the driver's door. It was very fast. Sheila keyed her radio. She said, Kearney 32, Kearney Com. Please advise, are you en route? Marcus said, in a normal voice, Kearney Com, Kearney 32, affirmative. En route back to station. Just pulling off the driveway now. Sheila said, Kearney 32, please confirm your interior is secure. There was a pause. Marcus said, Sheila, my interior is secure. I am alone in the vehicle. No passengers. Do you copy? Sheila said, Kearney 32, 10-4. She said into her headset, Adeline, the deputy says he is alone in the vehicle. Adeline said, it is in the back. Sheila said, Adeline said, he cannot see it. It is behind him. It is sitting in the middle of the back seat. It is watching the back of his head. Sheila said, Adeline said, I have to go. Sheila said, Adeline, stay on with me. Adeline said, it is not here anymore. It is in the deputy's car. It is not in my house anymore. It is gone. I have to go too. Sheila said, Adeline, please stay on. Adeline said, Sheila said, yes. Adeline said, I am sorry. I called because I thought if someone came, I would not be alone with it. I did not mean for it to go with the deputy. I am sorry. Sheila said, Adeline, the line clicked. The line went dead. Sheila sat at her workstation. She looked at the screen. The call had lasted 47 minutes and 11 seconds. The last spoken words on the transcript, which the system had auto-generated, were, I am sorry. She keyed her radio. She said, Kearney 32, Kearney Com. What is your position? Marcus said, Kearney Com, Kearney 32. I am at mile marker 7 on County Road F, headed east, about 8 minutes out from the station. Sheila said, Kearney 32, please confirm your welfare. Please confirm you are alone in the vehicle. Marcus said, in a normal voice that sounded exactly the way Marcus's voice always sounded, Sheila, I am fine. I am alone. Are you all right up there? That was a weird one. Sheila said, Kearney 32, are you experiencing any unusual sensations? Marcus said, Sheila, what are you asking me? Sheila said, Kearney 32, please answer the question. Marcus said, Sheila, I feel fine. I am driving my patrol vehicle back to the station. I am going to write up the call as a false report or a mental health referral. There is nothing wrong. Are you all right? Sheila said, Kearney 32, I am all right. Please advise when you arrive at the station. Marcus said, 10-4. They rode the radio in silence for the next 8 minutes. Devon was watching her. Devon said quietly, Sheila. Sheila said, yes, Devon said. You want me to send Voswick to intercept? Sheila said, for what? Devon said, I don't know. Sheila said, no, don't. Devon said, Sheila, what just happened? Sheila said, I don't know. Devon said, the caller. Sheila said, I don't know. Devon said, the caller who died in 2013. Sheila said, I don't know. Devon said, Sheila, if we file a report that says a woman who died in 2013 called 911 and reported an intruder at her burned-down house, we are going to be laughed out of this county. Sheila said, I know. Devon said, So what are we going to file? Sheila said, I don't know that either. They sat. The comm center was quiet. Sheila looked out the window at the parking lot. She could see the fluorescent lights along the perimeter of the lot. She could see the row of parked cruisers along the far side. She could see, beyond the lot, the dark of the field that ran up to the low ridge west of Minden. She could see, in the middle distance, headlights coming up the road. They were the headlights of a sheriff's cruiser. She watched them. They came up to the intersection at the entrance of the lot. They turned into the lot. They swung around into the row of cruisers along the far side. They stopped in the slot Marcus always parked in. They went off. Sheila watched. The interior light of the cruiser came on. She could not see, from her angle, whether anyone got out. She sat and watched for a while. At 4:12, the radio keyed. Marcus said, Kearney Com, Kearney 32. I am at the station. Pulling into the lot now. Going to write up the report and get some coffee. Devin said, copy, Kearney 32. 10-4. Marcus said, Kearney Com, Kearney 32. Signing off vehicle. Devin said 10-4. The radio went quiet. Sheila sat at her workstation. She looked at Devin. Devin looked at her. Sheila said, Devin. Devin said, yes. Sheila said, radio him in about 5 minutes. Just check in. Devin said, okay. They sat. The comm center was quiet. The county was quiet. There were no other calls. At 4:15, Devin keyed his radio. Devin said, Kearney 32, Kearney Com. Radio check. There was no answer. Devin said, Kearney 32, Kearney Com, radio check. There was no answer. Devin said, Kearney 32, Kearney Com, welfare check on Deputy Yale. There was no answer. Devin looked at Sheila. Sheila said, dispatch Voswick. Devin keyed his radio. He said, Kearney 27, Kearney Com. Deputy Ren Voswick, 44, on patrol somewhere on the east side of the county, keyed back. He said, Kearney Com, Kearney 27, go. Devin said, Kearney 27, please respond to the station. Welfare check on Deputy Yale. He is not responding on the radio. Voswick said, 10-4. En route to the station. ETA about 14 minutes. Sheila sat at her workstation. She looked out the window at the parking lot. She could see the corner of the parking lot from her workstation. She could see the fluorescent lights of the sheriff's office lot. She could see the row of cruisers. She could see Marcus's cruiser. It was in its spot in the third row. The interior light was on. She could not see, from her angle, whether anyone was in it. She sat and looked at it. She thought about Marcus. Marcus had been a deputy for the sheriff's office for 6 years. He had come to Kearney County from a job with the Nebraska State Patrol out of North Platte, where he had been an interstate deputy for 4 years before that. He had grown up on a ranch outside Chapel in the western panhandle. He had a wife named Ellery, who he had married 2 years ago, in an outdoor wedding at his family's ranch in June of 2024. Sheila had gone to the wedding. Sheila had brought the set of stoneware coffee mugs from the wedding registry, 4 of them, in a shade of blue that Ellery had said matched her kitchen curtains. Ellery had hugged her at the reception and had cried a little and had said thank you for coming. Marcus and Ellery had a son named Torin. He had been born in April of this year. Sheila had met Torin at the baby shower Ellery had at their house in June. Sheila had held him for a few minutes on the couch in Ellery's living room. Torin had been 6 weeks old. He had been small in her arms. He had been asleep. He had smelled the way small babies smell. Sheila sat at her workstation and looked at Marcus's cruiser in the parking lot and thought about Torin, 6 weeks old, asleep in her arms on Ellery's couch in June. At 4:27, Voswick pulled into the lot. She watched his headlights come in. He parked. He got out of his vehicle. He walked over to Marcus's cruiser. He looked in the driver's side window. He stopped. He stood there for a moment. Then he opened the driver's side door. He reached in. He stood back. He keyed his radio. He said, in a voice that Selah would remember for the rest of her life, "Kearney Com, Kearney 27. I need M's to the station lot. I have Deputy Yale in his vehicle. He is unresponsive. I have no pulse. Repeat, no pulse. Need M's forthwith." Devon keyed the tone out for the ambulance. Selah keyed her radio. She said, "Kearney 27, M's is en route. ETA approximately 6 minutes." She said, "Kearney 27, are you initiating CPR?" Voswick said, "Kearney Com, I am initiating CPR." "But Kearney Com," he paused. He said, "Kearney Com, he has been gone a while. He is cool to the touch. His skin is not right. It is like he has been gone longer than he should have been gone in the time he has been in the lot. I am initiating CPR, but I want you to know." Selah said 10-4. She sat at her workstation. The EMTs came. They worked on Marcus for 20 minutes. They took him to the Kearney County Community Hospital in Minden. He was pronounced dead at 5:08 a.m. The cause of death was later ruled by the county coroner cardiac arrest. Deputy Marcus Yale had been 31 years old. Selah finished her shift at 6 a.m. She wrote up the incident report for the call at 4832 County Road F. She wrote it up factually. She noted the caller had identified herself as Adeline Ostrand. She noted the address was a vacant, burned structure. She noted the caller had described events at the scene that appeared to correspond to Deputy Yale's activities as observed by radio. She noted the call had lasted 47 minutes and 11 seconds. She noted the caller had disconnected at approximately 3:21 a.m. She noted Deputy Yale had signed off vehicle at approximately 4:12 a.m. She noted Deputy Yale had been found unresponsive in his vehicle by Deputy Voswick at approximately 4:27 a.m. She did not include, in the report, the things Adeline had said in the last 5 minutes of the call. She did not include, in the report, that the caller had died in a fire in 2013. She did not include, in the report, what she believed had happened. She filed the report. She drove home. She lived in an apartment on 12th Street in Minden. It was on the second floor of a brick fourplex that had been built in the 70s. She had lived there for 6 years since her divorce from a man named Byrne, who had been her husband for 11 years and who now lived in Kearney and worked as a manager at a hardware store. She had, in the 6 years, made the apartment her own. She had painted the walls the pale gray she liked. She had hung a print of a Nebraska prairie above the couch. She had put in a bookshelf against the west wall. She had a cat, Wooly, who had come with her when she had left Byrne. She got home at 6:45. She sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time. 22 minutes, if she had checked her watch, which she did not. Then she went inside. Wooly met her at the door. He rubbed against her legs. She picked him up. She held him for a minute, standing in the entryway of her apartment with her uniform jacket still on, and pressed her face into the warm fur of his ruff, and did not cry, and then set him down and went into the kitchen and fed him. She showered. The hot water ran until she had used all of it, and until the shower had gone cold. And then she stayed under the cold water for another minute, and then she got out. She got into bed at 7:30 in the morning. She did not sleep. At noon, she got up. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table. She thought about Ellery. She thought about Torrin. She thought about whether she should call. She thought about what she would say. She thought about the stoneware coffee mugs. She did not call. She went to work that night at 10. The comm center was the same. The wall clock over the door was the same. The workstations were the same. Her chair was the same. Devon was there. Devin had brought her a pastry from the bakery on Main Street, a bear claw that she had told him a year ago was her favorite. He set it on her workstation without saying anything. She said, "Thank you." They sat. They did not talk about what had happened. The county was quiet. She took 6 calls between 10 and 2. All routine. A medical call for an elderly man in Wilcox with chest pain. 2 welfare checks. A noise complaint about a party in an apartment building on 2nd Street. A traffic accident on Highway 6 with no injuries. A domestic disturbance in a mobile home park that turned out to be a shouting match. Devin took 4. All routine. At 2:34 in the morning, her line rang. She keyed her headset. She said, 911. What is the address of your emergency? There was a pause. Then a man's voice said, "Please, it is in my house." Sheila closed her eyes. She said, "Sir, what is your address?" The man said an address on Highway 74 south of Minden. Sheila typed it into the CAD system. The system returned the address highlighted red. The flag read, "Premises vacant. Structure demolished 2007. No current occupancy." Sheila looked at the flag. She said, "Sir, what is your name?" The man said, "My name is Baron Halstead." Sheila typed the name. The system returned a record. A resident with that name had lived at the address until 1994. Baron Halstead, Dobbs 6/8/1934, deceased 8/22/2007, cause of death long-term illness, decedent at time of death, was a resident of the nursing home in Minden. Sheila looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked over at Devin. Devin was on his own call. He had not heard the ring on her line. Sheila keyed her mic. She said, "Sir, Mr. Halstead, I am going to stay on the line with you." Baron said, "Please." She said, "I am going to stay on the line with you, but I am not going to dispatch a deputy. Do you understand?" Baron said, "Why not?" Sheila said, "Mr. Halstead, I cannot send a deputy to your house, but I can stay on the line with you. I can talk with you. I can be here with you until it is over." Baron was quiet for a moment. Then Baron said, "I understand." Sheila said, "Tell me about your house, Mr. Halstead." Baron said, "It is a small one-story frame house. My father built it in 1930. I grew up in it. My wife and I raised our children in it. My wife's name was Merida. She died in 79. Sheila said, "Where are you in the house right now, Mr. Halstead?" Baron said, "I am in the front bedroom. It is in the kitchen." Sheila said, "Stay in the bedroom. Stay quiet. Talk to me. Tell me about Merida." Baron talked. He told Sheila about Merida. Merida had been a school teacher in Minden for 30 years. She had taught the 5th grade at the Consolidated Elementary School on Elm Street. She had been born in Bertrand in 1932. She had gone to the normal school in Kearney and had come to Minden to teach in 54. She had met Baron at a dance at the American Legion in Minden that fall. They had been married in 55. They had raised 3 children on the small farm on Highway 74. Their oldest, a boy named Kettering, had gone to Vietnam in 68 and had come back. Their middle child, a girl named Tessia, was a dental hygienist in Grand Island. Their youngest, a girl named Halden, had died in a car accident on I-80 in 1989 at the age of 22. Merida had died of an illness in 79. She had been 47. Baron had lived on the farm alone for 28 years after Merida died. He had, in the 90s, sold most of the acreage to a neighbor. He had kept the house and the 2-acre yard around it. He had, in 2006, moved into the nursing home in Minden because he could no longer take care of himself. He had died in the nursing home in August of 2007. The county had, in the years since, demolished the house on Highway 74 as part of a right-of-way expansion for the highway. There was nothing there now. But he was on the phone. He was on the reckoning of a dispatcher of 11 years who had spent the previous night listening to Adeline Ostrin describe the presence at her pantry door, calling from a house that did not exist anymore. In a room in that house, that was the room he had been in when he had gone to sleep every night. For the last 12 years, he had lived on the farm. Selah listened. She kept the line open. She did not dispatch. She did not tell Devon. She did not, on the reckoning of what she had done the night before, do anything except sit at her workstation with her headset on and listen to a man who had been dead for 19 years tell her about his wife. Barron talked. At the end, at 3:17 a.m., after 41 minutes on the line, Barron said, "Selah." Selah said, "Yes." Barron said, "Thank you." Selah said, "Mr. Halstead." Barron said, "It is at the bedroom door now." Selah said, "Mr. Halstead, stay with me." Barron said, "I am not afraid, Selah. I am ready. I have been by myself for a very long time." Selah said, "Mr. Halstead." Barron said, "I only called because I did not want to be alone with it when it happened. I am not alone. I am on the phone with you. That is enough." Selah said, "I am here, Mr. Halstead." Barron said, "I know." The line clicked. Selah logged the call. She did not dispatch. She wrote in the incident report, "Hoax call. No action taken." She filed the report. She took the next call. For the next 11 weeks, it happened 3 or 4 nights a week. Sometimes the caller was a man. Sometimes it was a woman. Sometimes the address was a burned-down farmstead. Sometimes it was a demolished house. Sometimes it was an empty lot where a structure had been standing when the caller had been alive and had been cleared long since. Always the caller was calling about something in the house. Always the caller was in a bedroom, or a pantry, or a closet, or a basement. Always the caller was afraid. Selah stayed on the line. She did not dispatch. She did not tell Devon. She learned over the 11 weeks that if she stayed on the line long enough, if she got the caller talking about their spouse, their children, their farm, their work, their small life, the caller would come to a place where they were ready. They would say goodbye. The line would click. They would go. She did not know where they went. She did not know what took them. She did not know why they called her, or why they called her at 2:34 in the morning, or why they called on her line and not Devon's. She did not ask. She did the work. She filed the calls as hoax calls. She wrote in the incident reports, "Hoax call. No action taken." The sheriff read the reports. The sheriff was a man named Yancey Vroon, who had been the sheriff of Kearney County for 18 years, and who had, in the wake of Marcus Yale's death, been the person who had gone to Ellery's house the morning after, and had told her. The sheriff had known Marcus for the whole 6 years Marcus had been with the department. He had, on the reckoning of a man who had come up in the sheriff's office and had come to sit in the corner office on the first floor of the Justice Center, been shaken by Marcus's death. The sheriff had, one afternoon in early December, called Selah into his office. He had said, "Selah, sit down." Selah had sat down. The sheriff had said, "Selah, you are getting a lot of hoax calls lately." Selah had said, "Yes, sir." The sheriff had said, 3 or 4 a week. Selah had said, "Yes, sir," the sheriff had said. "The reports say you're staying on the line for 40 minutes or more." Selah had said, "Yes, sir," the sheriff had said. "Hesitat." "Selah, why are you staying on the line?" Selah had looked at the sheriff for a long moment. Then Selah had said, "Sheriff, I am staying on the line because the callers asked me to." The sheriff had said, "Selah." Selah had said, "Sheriff, I am not dispatching a deputy on any of these calls. I am not putting anyone at risk. I am handling the calls in the way I judge is the correct way to handle them. I am doing my job. The sheriff had said, Sela. She had said, Sheriff, if you would like to review my judgment, please review it. I have 11 years in this position. My performance evaluations have all been strong. I have not lost a deputy on my watch in 11 years, except one. The sheriff had said, Sela, Marcus's death was not your fault. Sela had said, Sheriff, I am not saying it was. I am saying I have learned from it. I will not dispatch on these calls. The sheriff had looked at her for a long time. Then the sheriff had said, Sela, all right. I will trust your judgment. Keep filing the reports as hoax calls. If it goes on much longer, we may need to talk about whether the department needs a policy on this kind of call. But for now, do what you are doing. Sela had said, yes, sir. The sheriff had said, Sela, she had said, yes. The sheriff had said, are you all right? Sela had said, yes, sir. I am all right. The sheriff had said, you would tell me if you were not. Sela had said, yes, sir, I would. She had left the office. She had gone back to the comm center. She had taken the next call. She was Sela Marsden. She was 39. She was a dispatcher for the Kearney County Sheriff's Office. She was the one who stayed on the line with the dead. She would not send another deputy. She would sit at her workstation and listen. She would ask about wives and children and dogs and gardens and porches and cardinals at bird feeders. She would keep the line open. She would be the last voice. She would not tell anyone what she was doing. She would work the shift for the rest of her career. That was the job now. She was going to do it well. Captain Isham Lundeen was 61 years old and had been the master of the M.V. Cormorant, a 98-foot state ferry running the winter service from Rockland to Little Ram Island off the coast of Maine for 30 years. And on the 17th of February, 2026, on the 4 p.m. run from Rockland out to the island, he took on a new mate. The new mate was Callum Voss. Callum was 24 years old. He was from Bristol, Maine. He was 5'9" and lean the way a boy who had grown up on the water is lean, with sandy hair he wore cut short, and a habitual small squint that came, on Isham's red, from a lifetime of looking at the glare of afternoon sun off the surface of the waters around Booth Bay Harbor and Muscongas Bay. Callum had worked summers for 4 years on the Whale, watching boats out of Booth Bay. He had, in the last of those summers, been the primary mate on an 82-foot boat called the Sarah Elizabeth that ran out to the Whale grounds 3 times a day in the summer months. He had his 100-ton master's ticket, which he had earned the previous winter at the Maritime Academy program in Rockland. He had come to the State Ferry Service in December looking for year-round work. Isham had interviewed him in the first week of January. The interview had happened in the small office of the ferry terminal on the pier in Rockland on a Tuesday morning in the first cold snap of the year, when the wind was out of the northeast at 22 knots, and the harbor was moving in the way it moved when it was thinking about freezing. Isham had sat behind the small desk. Callum had sat across from him in the folding chair that had been in the office for as long as Isham had been captain. The wind had been rattling the loose flashing on the roof over their heads. Isham had said, Callum Voss. Callum had said, yes, sir. Isham had said, you are from Bristol. Callum had said, yes, sir. Isham had said, Voss is a Bristol name. Callum had said, yes, sir. Isham had said, there was a Voss who was a mate on the ferry service in the early 2000s, a woman. Callum had looked at Isham for a moment. Then Callum had said, "That was my Aunt Merritt." Isham had said, "Merritt Boss." Callum had said, "Yes, sir." Isham had said, "I knew her a little." Callum had said, "She died in '02." Isham had said, "I know. I went to her funeral." Callum had said, "That was before I was born." Isham had looked at Callum for a long moment. Then Isham had said, "How old are you, Callum?" Callum had said, "24, sir. Born in '02." Isham had said, "You were born the year your aunt died." Callum had said, "Yes, sir." Isham had looked at Callum some more. Then Isham had said, "All right, Callum, tell me why you want the job." Callum had told him. He had talked for about 8 minutes about the whale-watching seasons, about the rhythms of a year-round marine job, about wanting to be on a boat in winter and not just summer, about wanting a state benefits package, about wanting to work on a boat where the passengers had somewhere to actually go. He had spoken competently. He had known the vocabulary of a mate. He had, in the quiet way of a downeaster, who had grown up on boats and had come to the trade without any of the noise that some younger deckhands brought with them, been someone Isham could see himself standing beside in the pilot house at 4 in the morning in February, with the wheelhouse windows fogged over from the weather outside. Isham had liked him. Isham had also known, on the quiet reckoning of a captain of 30 years, who had watched two mates die inside a year of speaking to the passenger, that Callum was Merritt's nephew, and that Merritt had been one of the two who had spoken, and that Callum was going to be tested by the arrangement of the boat in a way, whether or not Isham chose to hire him. Isham had hired him anyway. Isham had, in the days and weeks after, thought about that choice more than once. The Maine State Ferry Service had assigned Callum to the Cormorant on the 1st of February. Isham and Callum had run 4 trips together in the weeks since. Callum was competent. He was quiet. He listened. He did what Isham told him. He did not ask questions. Isham was, on the reckoning of a captain of 30 years, pleased with him. The winter service to Little Ram was a small operation. In the summer months, the Cormorant made 3 round trips a day and hauled tourists and vehicles for the summer community that lived on Little Ram from Memorial Day through Labor Day. The summer community was about 400 people. They came from Boston and New York and Philadelphia mostly. They had summer houses on the east side of Little Ram, most of them 100 years old or older, most of them shingle-style Victorian summer cottages, built between 1880 and 1912, when Little Ram had been a fashionable summer destination for a kind of well-off New Englander who wanted the quiet of a small island. The community had shrunk in the middle years of the 20th century as summer fashions had moved on to Bar Harbor and Kennebunkport, but a core of about 70 families had kept their houses through the generations, and the Cormorant hauled them out in the summer. In the winter months, the Cormorant made 1 round trip a day, 6 days a week, and hauled mail and groceries, and the handful of year-round residents who lived on the island through the winter. There were 14 year-round residents on Little Ram in the winter of 2026. Isham knew all 14 of them by name, and had known most of them for the whole 30 years he had been on the run. The year-rounders were the Bruntle sisters, Alta and Greer, both in their 70s, both unmarried, who had inherited a saltwater farm on the north end of the island from their father and had run it as a goat cheese operation for the last 40 years. They were the first stop for anyone new to the island. They knew everyone. They ran the island's informal post office out of their kitchen. Alta was the older, by 2 years. Greer was the one who did most of the talking. Torval Halyard, 72, a widower, who had been the harbor master of Little Ram for 50 years before his retirement in the previous January. He still lived in the harbor master's cottage on the inner harbor. The state paid him a small retainer to keep an eye on things. The Karsten family, Petter, 40, his wife Renneke, 38. Their 3 children, ages 11, 9, and 6, who ran the general store on the island out of a building near the ferry dock. Peter was Norwegian by birth. He had come to Little Ram in the late 2000s after meeting Renneke, a Little Ram native, at a university in Portland. The Aldenverst family, Errol and Odette, both in their 60s, who ran a bed and breakfast on the island that was mostly closed in winter, but stayed open for the handful of winter visitors that came out to the island for skiing at the small Nordic ski trails Errol had cut in the woods behind their house. And a handful of others. A lobsterman, Ronette Tamvig, who had been on the island his whole life. An artist, Marbetta Kralt, who had come out to Little Ram in the 90s from Boston and had never left. An old man named Vernon Kestrel, who lived alone in a cabin on the west side and who took the ferry once a month to Rockland to get his groceries and his medication. 14 in total. Isham knew them all. He also knew, on the reckoning of a captain of 30 years, that on rare occasions the boat carried a 15th passenger. A passenger who was not a year-rounder. A passenger who did not appear on any manifest. A passenger who rode from Rockland to Little Ram once every 3 years or so, and who was not on the quiet understanding of everyone who had ever run the cormorant to be spoken to. Isham had seen him 9 times in his 30 years. On the 17th of February, the wind was out of the northeast at 18 knots. There was ice in the channel between Owl's Head and the island. The cormorant had a reinforced bow for the winter service and could break through the channel ice on the runout. The 4 p.m. departure from Rockland was the last run of the day. It arrived at Little Ram at 5:10 p.m. It stayed at the island overnight. It ran back in the morning at 7. Isham was in the pilot house. He had the wheel. Callum was on the deck, doing the last check on the lines and the freight before they left the Rockland pier. At 3:58, as Isham was watching the last of the passengers board the ferry, there were 3 that afternoon. 2 of them, the Bruntel sisters, returning to Little Ram from an appointment in Portland, and one an elderly man Isham did not recognize. Callum came up to the pilot house. Callum said, "Cap, there's a passenger I need to ask you about." Isham said, "Who?" Callum said, the old man. "He does not have a car. He does not have a bag. He came aboard with no ticket. When I asked him for his ticket, he said he was ticketed at the far end." Isham looked out through the pilot house window. He could see the man on the passenger deck. The man was standing at the rail, looking out at the harbor. He was wearing a long, dark coat. He had a felt hat. He was leaning on the rail with his forearms folded on the top rail. Isham looked at the man for a long moment. The man was, on the look of him, as he had been the 9 other times Isham had seen him. A man of about 60. Lean, weathered, the face of someone who had spent his life outdoors. The dark coat was the same dark coat, and the felt hat was the same felt hat, and the position at the rail with the forearms folded was the same position at the rail. Isham had seen him for the first time in the summer of 1997, on his 2nd year as captain of the Cormorant. He had seen him again in 2000, in 2002, in 2005, in 2008, in 2011, in 2014, in 2017, in 2021. Then Isham said, "Callum, come here." Callum came over. Isham said, "Callum, that is not a passenger." Callum said, "Cap," Isham said, "that man is going to ride out with us to the island. He does not need a ticket. He is not to be spoken to. He is not to be looked at. You are to stay in the pilot house with me for the entire run out. You are not to go to the passenger deck." Do you understand me? Callum looked at Isham. Callum said, Cap, what are you telling me? Isham said, I am telling you what I need you to do. Stay in the pilot house. Do not speak to him. Do not look at him. When we get to the far dock, stay in the pilot house until he has debarked. Do not go out on deck until I tell you it is safe to. Callum said, Cap, is this a joke? Isham said, Callum, I have been on this run for 30 years. In those 30 years, he has come aboard 9 times. Once every 3 years, more or less. He rides to the island. He gets off. He does not come back. I have never spoken to him. My mate before you, a man named Torvald Kestrel, did not speak to him. The mate before Torvald, a man named Wynne Danforth, did not speak to him. The captain who ran this route before me, a woman named Marla Alden, did not speak to him. She told me about him before she retired in '96. She had been on the run 22 years. She had seen him 7 times. She had never spoken to him. She told me not to. She said the captain before her had told her not to. She said he had told her that his captain had told him not to. She did not know when it started. Callum stared at Isham. Callum said, Cap, that is a man in a coat standing at the rail. You are telling me not to look at him. Isham said, I am telling you not to look at him. Callum said, why not? Isham said, because he does not want to be looked at. Callum said, Cap, Isham said, Callum, this is not a discussion. You are a mate on my boat. I am telling you what to do. Stay in the pilot house. Do not speak to him. Do not look at him. When we get to the far dock, wait until he has debarked. Then we do the tie-up. Callum was quiet for a moment. He looked out the pilot house window at the man on the deck. Then Callum said, Cap, are you telling me the ferry is haunted? Isham said, I am not telling you that. I am telling you what I need you to do. Callum said, Cap, all due respect, I am going to check the tickets on the passenger deck like I am supposed to. I am going to check his ticket. If he does not have a ticket, I am going to ask him to buy one. That is my job. Isham looked at Callum for a long time. Then Isham said, Callum said, yes, Cap. Isham said, I am asking you not to. Callum said, Cap, I understand you're asking me not to. But the state pays me to check tickets. I am going to check tickets. Isham was quiet for a moment. He said, Callum, if you go out on that deck and speak to him, if you speak to him even once, I want you to understand that whatever happens after is not going to be something I can help you with. I have watched 2 mates in 30 years speak to him. One was a man named Del Halverson. He spoke to him in '99. He was on my boat for 8 more months. He drowned in the harbor at Rockland in November of that year. He was on his skiff coming back from checking a lobster pot outside the breakwater. Sea was calm. There was no reason for him to go over. He went over. The other was a woman named Merritt Voss. Callum's face changed. Callum said, Merritt. Isham said, yes. Callum said, Merritt Voss was my aunt. Isham said, I know she was. Callum said, you knew that. Isham said, I knew it when I hired you. I remembered her name. I remembered her family was from Bristol. When you came in for the interview, I asked you if you were related to Merritt Voss, who had been a mate on the state ferries in the early 2000s. You said she was your aunt. Callum said, you did not tell me she had been on this boat. Isham said, I did not. She was on the Cormorant in '02. She spoke to him on a run out in March of '02. She was on the boat for 4 more months. In July of '02, she drove her car off the road on Route 1 north of Rockland on a clear afternoon. There was no reason for the car to go off the road. The car went off the road. She died at the scene. Callum stood in the pilot house. The wind was moving through the rigging above the pilot house. The cormorant's engines were idling. The 3:58 departure was 2 minutes out. Callum said, "Cap." Isham said, "Yes." Callum said, "Why did you hire me?" Isham said, "Because you were a good mate. Because your aunt had been a good mate. Because I wanted a mate on this boat who came from a family that already knew the coast and the boats and the way things are on the water." Callum said, "You wanted me to know." Isham said, "I wanted you to know when I told you, which I am telling you now." Callum stared at the man in the coat on the passenger deck. Callum said, "Cap, I am going to check the tickets." Isham looked at him for a long moment. Isham said, "Callum, I am asking you a last time. Do not." Callum said, "Cap, it is my job." Isham said, "It is not." Callum said, "It is." Isham said, "Callum, if you go out on that deck, I am going to have to write you up. If you speak to him, I am going to have to remember that I told you not to. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Callum said, "I understand, Cap." Isham said, "Then go." Callum went. Isham watched from the pilot house. Callum went out onto the passenger deck. He walked past the Bruntle sisters, who were sitting on the bench along the port rail with their hands in their laps. Greer looked up as Callum passed. Greer's face did not change, but Isham saw her put her hand on Alta's arm, and Alta glanced up too, and the two of them watched Callum walk to the man in the coat. Callum stopped beside him. Isham could not hear what Callum said. He could see Callum speak. He could see Callum's mouth move. He could see the man in the coat turn slowly from the rail to look at Callum. He could see the man's face, an old face, weathered, with a patient expression that Isham had seen from the pilot house 8 times over the years. The man did not speak at first. The man looked at Callum for a moment. Then the man's mouth moved. Then Callum's mouth moved. Then the man's mouth moved. Then the man reached into the inside pocket of his coat and handed Callum a piece of paper. Callum took the paper. Callum looked at it. Callum nodded. Callum turned and walked back toward the pilot house. The Bruntle sisters watched Callum come back. The man in the coat resumed his position at the rail. Callum came back into the pilot house. He was holding the piece of paper. He held it out to Isham. Isham did not take it. Isham said, "What did he say to you?" Callum said, "He said, 'Thank you for asking.' He said, 'The ticket is on the paper.' He said, 'I will get off at the far dock.'" Isham said, "What is on the paper?" Callum said, "I don't know." Look, Callum held the paper out. Isham looked. The paper was a ferry ticket, a standard Main State Ferry Service one-way ticket from Rockland to Little Ram Island. The ticket had a date stamp. The date on the ticket was August 14th, 1909. Isham looked at the ticket for a long time. Then he said, "Callum, go start the 4 p.m. departure procedure. Cast off lines." Callum said, "Cap." Isham said, "Go." Callum went. Isham stood in the pilot house. He held the ticket in his hand for a moment. Then he opened the drawer under the chart table where he kept receipts and duplicates. He put the ticket in the drawer. He closed the drawer. He would leave it there. He would not throw it away. He watched Callum on the deck, casting off the bowline. Then the stern line. Callum came back into the pilot house. Isham brought the engines up. The cormorant pulled away from the Rockland Pier. The run-out took an hour and 12 minutes. The wind was on the port bow. The chop was 2 to 3 feet. The cormorant broke the channel ice about halfway across. Isham did not look at the passenger deck. Callum did not go back out. Neither of them spoke on the run. Isham watched the ice. He watched the bearing on the compass. He watched the outline of Little Ram coming up out of the gray of the winter afternoon. He watched the far light on the point at the entrance of the harbor come into view. Callum stood at the mate's post at the aft of the pilot house. He did not speak. He watched the water. At 5:10 p.m., they arrived at the dock on Little Ram. Isham brought the cormorant alongside. He tied up. He waited. The old man walked off the ferry first. He walked down the passenger ramp. He walked onto the dock. He walked past the fuel shed at the head of the dock. He walked up the road. He was gone into the dusk before the Bruntel sisters had even gathered their things. Isham watched him go. He watched him up the road until the dark took him. Then he said to Callum, "All right, mate, get the ramp secured." Callum went out on deck. The Bruntel sisters walked off the ferry. Alta gave Isham a small nod as she passed the pilot house. Greer did not look up. The cormorant tied up for the night at Little Ram. Isham and Callum had the small crew quarters at the state office on the island. They had a small dinner at the inn that stayed open in winter for the ferry crew and any visitors. They did not talk about the man in the coat over dinner. The inn was called the Wren House. It was owned by the Alden Verst family. Odette served them the winter menu, a fish chowder and a bread and a glass of the local cider. Odette was a quiet woman of about 62 who had known Isham for the whole of his years as captain of the Cormorant. She had, when Isham had come in with Callum, given Isham the look of a woman who had known Merritt Vaus from the ferry and had known that Callum was Merritt's nephew. Isham had introduced them at the door. Odette had shaken Callum's hand and had said, "Welcome to Little Ram, Callum Vaus. Your aunt was a fine mate on this ferry. I hope you will be a fine mate, too." Callum had said, "Thank you, ma'am." They had eaten in the quiet of the winter dining room. At 10, Callum said good night. He went to his room. Isham sat in the common room with a mug of coffee for a long time. He thought about Merritt Vaus. He thought about how he had watched her in March of 2002 on this same boat walk out onto the passenger deck and speak to the man in the coat. He thought about how he had told her not to. He thought about how she had done it anyway. He thought about how she had died 4 months later. He thought about Callum. He thought about how Callum was Merritt's nephew. He thought about how Callum was 24. He thought about how Isham had hired him, partly because he had wanted a Voss on the boat. Again. He thought about whether he had been fair. He thought about the ticket in the drawer under the chart table on the Cormorant. He thought about August 14th, 1909. He thought about it for a long time. He went to bed at midnight. He slept badly. In the morning, they ran the Cormorant back. The wind had shifted overnight to the southwest. The channel was easier. They had 2 passengers on the run back, one of the herring buyers from Owl's Head, who had been on the island buying, and a woman going to see her mother in Bangor. Callum was competent on the deck. He was quiet. He was on the reckoning of a captain of 30 years, not different from the mate he had been the day before. Isham was not fooled. Isham had watched Merritt Vaus after her conversation. Merritt had been competent. Merritt had been quiet. Merritt had been, on the reckoning of the captain of the ferry in the summer of 2002, not different from the mate she had been the day before her conversation. And in July, Merritt's car had gone off the road on Route 1 north of Rockland on a clear afternoon. Isham watched Callum. He watched him through the spring. Callum ran the boat well in March. Callum ran the boat well in April. In April, the ice broke up in the channel. The runs got easier. The winter service transitioned to the shoulder season schedule at the end of May, which meant 2 round trips a day instead of 1, and more passengers, and the beginning of the summer traffic pattern. Callum was steady through all of it. But Isham watched him. He watched Callum's eyes. Callum's eyes were on the reckoning of a captain of 30 years, not the eyes they had been on the 17th of February. There was a quiet in them, a distance, the look of a man who was thinking about something he did not talk about, and who was thinking about it a lot, and who had been thinking about it for a long time. Isham had seen the look before, in Merritt, in Del Halverson, in the handful of other mates over the years who had come close to speaking to the man in the coat, and had not, quite, but had come close enough to have seen the quality of him, and to have wondered. Callum had the look. Isham did not say anything. There was nothing to say. In June, the summer service began. The cormorant went to its 3-round trips-a-day schedule. The summer people came out to their houses. The rhythms of the summer months settled over the run. Callum handled the summer well. He was good with passengers. He was good with the summer tourists who came out on day trips and asked the questions summer tourists asked. He was good with the summer residents who knew the boat well and who had their preferences and their complaints. He was, on the reckoning of the ferry service management in Rockland, working out well as a mate. But Isham watched him. He watched Callum's eyes. In August, on a run out on a Wednesday afternoon with the sea flat calm, and the boat carrying the full complement of 84 passengers and the loaded vehicle deck, Callum said to Isham in the pilot house, "Cap," Isham said. "Yes," Callum said. "I have been thinking about what he said." Isham said, "The man on the ferry." Callum said, "Yes," Isham said. "You said," he said, "the ticket is on the paper. And thank you for asking. And I will get off at the far dock." Callum said he said something else. Isham looked at Callum. Isham said, "What did he say?" Callum said, he said he had been on the ferry a long time. He said the ferry had been running out to the island since 1842. He said he had been on it since the first run. He said his job was to keep something on the mainland from following the ferry to the island. He said if he ever missed the run, the thing on the mainland would come with the ferry to the island. He said he was tired. He said he had asked me, when I had spoken to him, if I would take his job. He said he had asked all the mates. He said none of them had said yes yet. He said he was tired. He said he did not know how much longer he could do it. Isham looked at Callum. Isham said, Callum said, "I told him no." Isham said, "Good." Callum said, "I have been thinking about it." Isham said, Callum said, "He was tired, Cap. He was very tired." Isham said, "Callum, listen to me. Do not go back to him." Callum said, "He will not be on the boat again for 3 years. He only comes every 3 years." "Cap," Isham said, "Callum, he may come sooner, if he thinks you have been considering. He may come sooner." Callum was quiet for a while. Callum said, "Cap, would that be a bad thing?" Isham looked at Callum for a long time. Isham said, "Callum, it would be a very bad thing." Callum said, "Cap, if I said yes, if I took the job, what would happen?" Isham said, "Callum, I do not know. But I have watched 2 people who spoke to him die within a year. I do not know if they said yes to him or no. I do not know what happens to those who say yes. I only know what happens to those who speak to him." Callum was quiet. Callum said, "Cap, my Aunt Merritt." Isham said yes. Callum said she said no to him. Isham said, "I do not know what she said." Callum said, "But she died." Isham said yes. Callum said, "So if she said no and died, and if I said no?" Then Isham said, "Callum, do not think about this." Callum said, "But Cap." Isham said, "Do not think about it. Do the work. Come to the boat every morning. Tie up every night. Go home. Do not think about him." Callum did not answer. He looked out through the pilot house window at the late summer light on the water. They ran the boat back to Rockland in silence. Isham watched Callum. Callum was thinking. Callum was on the reckoning of a captain of 30 years, thinking hard about something that had been asked of him, and that he had said no to, and that he was now, 5 months later, revisiting. Isham had, on the run back in the pilot house, thought about whether to call Callum's mother in Bristol. Callum's mother's name was Alma Vosses. She was Miret's sister-in-law. She had, Isham knew from the funeral in '02, been the person who had taken care of Miret in the last weeks of Miret's life, when Miret had been going quietly wrong in the way a person went wrong after speaking to the man in the coat. Alma had known. Isham had thought about calling Alma. He had thought about telling her that her son was going the same way her sister-in-law had gone. He had thought about it. He had not called. He did not know what he would have said. He did not know what Alma would have been able to do. Callum was 24. Callum was a competent mate on a state ferry. Callum was, on the outside view, doing his job well. Alma would not have been able to make him stop. Isham had, on the reckoning of a captain of 30 years, who had watched Miret walk into her fate, thought that the thing that was going to happen to Callum was already in motion, and that the most he could do was to be there for Callum when it came time. That was, on the reckoning, not enough. But it was what he had. In September, Callum was quieter than he had been in August. He worked the boat well. He did not speak of the man in the coat again. In October, the summer season ended. The Cormorant went back to its shoulder season schedule. The summer people packed up their houses and went back to Boston and New York and Philadelphia. The rhythms of the autumn months settled over the run. Callum was quieter still. In late October, the winter service began. The Cormorant went to its one-round trip-a-day schedule. The handful of year-round residents settled in for the long dark of the coastal Maine winter. Callum was very quiet by November. He came to the boat every morning. He tied up every night. He did the work well. He did not speak of the man in the coat. He did not, on the outside look of a mate on his job, do anything wrong. Isham watched him. On the afternoon of the 11th of November, on the run-in from Little Ram, Callum said to Isham in the pilot house, Cap, Isham said. Yes, Callum said, I have decided. Isham looked at Callum. Isham said, Callum, do not tell me. Callum said, Cap, Isham said, Callum, if you have decided to take his job, do not tell me. I do not want to know. Callum was quiet for a long moment. Then Callum said, Cap, I have decided not to. Isham looked at Callum. Isham said, Callum said, I have thought about it since August. I have thought about it every day. I have thought about my Aunt Miret and about what she did and about what she was thinking when she did it. I have thought about the man on the ferry and about what he asked me and about what it would mean to say yes. Isham said, Callum said, Cap, I have decided not to. I am too young. I am 24. I have a life. I have my mother in Bristol. I have my cousins. I have my job on the ferry. I have my future. I am not going to take his job. I am not going to spend the rest of forever standing at the rail of this boat, riding out to Little Ram once every 3 years to keep something on the mainland from following the ferry. I am not doing that. Isham said, Callum, that is the right decision. Callum said, Cap, but. Isham said, but what? Callum said, Cap, my Aunt Miret said no, and she died 4 months later. Del Halverson said no, and he died 8 months later. Cap, I have been on the boat 9 months now. I said no in August. It has been 3 months. I do not know how long I have. Isham said, Callum. Callum said, Cap, I want you to know I have decided not to. I want you to know that whatever happens to me, whether I go into the water like Del or off Route 1 like Miret, or however I go, I have said no. I have chosen my life. I have chosen the short life I am going to have as Callum Vause of Bristol, Maine, over the long life I could have had as the man on the ferry. I want you to know that. Isham stood in the pilot house. He looked at Callum. Then he said, "Callum, I hear you." Callum said, "Cap." Isham said, "Yes." Callum said, "Thank you." Isham said, "Callum." Callum said, "Yes." Isham said, "I am sorry. I hired you knowing I should not have." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then Callum said, "Cap, I do not know that you should not have. I have thought about it. Someone was going to be the mate on this boat. Someone was going to speak to him. Someone was going to have this choice. I am glad it was me. My aunt was on this boat. She had this choice." She said no. I think she would have wanted a family member to have this choice too, and to say no too, so that our family had a record of saying no, so that our name meant a thing on this run of this boat. Isham said, "Callum." Callum said, "Cap, I want you to know that, if I go quickly, I want you to know I am at peace." Isham said, "Callum." Callum said, "Yes." Isham said, "You do not have to go quickly." Callum said, "Cap, it is not up to me." They ran the boat back to Rockland in silence. Callum went home that night. He did not come to work the next morning. Isham called him at 7. Callum did not answer. Isham called Callum's landlord. The landlord went to Callum's apartment. Callum was not there. Isham drove out to the Rockland Pier at 11 that morning. He walked along the pier. He looked at the water. He did not see Callum. He walked back to the ferry. He ran the 11:30 run to Little Ram with a substitute mate the state office had sent over. That afternoon, the Coast Guard found Callum's small skiff drifting off Owl's Head. There was no one aboard. Callum's shoes were on the deck of the skiff, together, side by side, as if he had taken them off, carefully, before he had gone over. They found Callum's body 2 days later, washed up on the shore of Monhegan Island, 13 miles southeast of where the skiff had been found. Isham went to the funeral in Bristol. The funeral was on a Saturday in the old Congregational Church on the hill above Pemaquid Harbor. The November day was gray. The cold was in the wind off the water. The mourners were about 80 of them, most from Bristol and Boothbay and the stretch of coast up to Damariscotta. Isham was one of the few from Rockland. Callum's mother, whose name was Alma Vause, was there. She was Merritt's sister-in-law. She was 61, Isham's age. She had lost her sister-in-law in 2002, and now she had lost her son. She stood at the front of the church and shook the hands of the mourners. When Isham came through the line, she took his hand. She said, "Isham." "Isham," said Alma. She said, "Was he a good mate?" Isham said he was a very good mate. He was, on my 30 years, one of the best mates I ever had. She said, "Thank you." He said, "I am sorry, Alma." She said, "You did not do this, Isham." He said, "I hired him." "Alma, I knew who his aunt was. I hired him anyway." She said, "Isham, Merritt told me about the ferry at the end. Merritt said she had spoken to a man on the ferry who was not a man. She said she wished she had not. She said if she had it to do over, she would not have. She said she thought she had made a bad decision. She wrote me a letter about it 3 weeks before she died. I still have it." Isham said, "Alma," she said, "Callum knew." Callum read the letter. He knew before he took the job. Isham said, "Alma," she said, "he took the job anyway. He wanted to see for himself. He was that kind of boy. He always was." Isham stood in the line at the front of the church in Bristol on a Saturday in November of 2026 and looked at Alma Vause. He said, "Alma, I am sorry." She said, "Isham, I forgive you. I want you to know that. Merritt would have too. Callum would have. Do not carry it." Isham said, "I will try." She said, "Try hard, Isham. There are not many of you left. The Ferry needs a captain who knows. Isham said, I know. She said, go back tomorrow. Isham said, I will. They embraced. Isham drove back to Rockland that night. He got to his house on Camden Street at 11. He sat in the kitchen with his coat still on for a long time. He thought about Callum's shoes on the deck of the skiff, together, side by side. He thought about what Callum had said in the pilot house, about choosing the short life, about the family name meaning a thing on the run of the boat. He thought about it. Then he stood up. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. He made himself a cup of tea. He drank it in the kitchen with the single lamp on over the old table his father had made. He went to bed. In the morning at 7, he drove to the pier. He ran the 8 a.m. departure. He ran the winter schedule for the rest of the year. He ran it into the next year. He ran it into the year after that. The man in the coat came aboard on a run out on a Tuesday in November of 2029. Isham saw him from the pilot house. Isham looked at him for a long moment. Then Isham said out loud, in the pilot house, alone, I am still here. Callum said no. Merritt said no. I am still here. The boat is still running. The island is still there. You have your ride. You will get off at the far dock. That is the arrangement. The man in the coat stood at the rail and looked out at the sea. He did not turn. He did not look at the pilot house. He rode to Little Ram. He walked off the ferry. He walked up the road. He was gone into the dusk before the fuel shed had even shut down its pumps for the night. Isham watched him go. Then he tied up the ferry. He would run the boat for another 6 years. The man in the coat would come aboard twice more in that time. Isham would not speak to him. His mates would not speak to him. Isham had learned, at last, on the occasion of the loss of Callum Vos, to warn them properly. Isham would tell each new mate on their first day, in the pilot house, everything. He would tell them about Merritt. He would tell them about Callum. He would tell them about Del Halverson. He would tell them that the man in the coat was going to come aboard sometime in their years on the ferry, and that when he did, they were to stay in the pilot house, and that under no circumstances were they to speak to him. Isham would tell them why. Isham would not, as Marla Alden had done with him in the summer of '96, and as Isham had done with Callum in the winter of 2026, leave any of it unsaid. Isham would retire in 2032 at 67. He would train the captain who came after him, a woman named Enid Halstead, in the year before his retirement. He would take her out on the run for a full year of runs. In November of the year of the training, the man in the coat would come aboard. Isham would tell Enid, in the pilot house, everything. Enid would listen. Enid would not go out on the deck. Enid would not speak to him. Enid would remember. The ferry would keep running. The man in the coat would keep riding. The mainland would keep from following. And Callum Vos would be at rest in the cemetery in Bristol, beside his Aunt Merritt and his grandmother and his great-grandfather, who had been a fisherman out of that town for the whole of his 68 years. Isham would visit the grave once a year, in April, on the anniversary of Callum's birthday. He would sit for a while. He would say the things he had to say. He would say, sometimes, Callum, I am running the boat. The man in the coat still comes. I still do not speak to him. The mates I train do not speak to him. Your name means a thing on the run of the boat. It means no. That is what your name means. Your aunt would have wanted that. I want that too. Thank you for what you did. He would say those things, or things close to them, sitting on the grass in front of the stone in the cemetery in Bristol on the April afternoon. Then he would stand up. He would put his hand on the top of the stone. He would go. He would drive back to Rockland. He would work the boat. He would run the ferry to Little Ram for the rest of his time. That was the work. He was going to do it well. Ansel Torvik was 62 years old, and he lived alone in a small house on the edge of the town of Absaroka, Montana. And for 44 years, he had been an amateur radio operator, call sign K7 Ranger Baker Foxtrot. And on the 4th of October, 2026, at 3:47 in the morning, he was in the radio room in the back of his house when he picked up the signal. The radio room was the small back bedroom of the small 3-bedroom ranch house he and his wife Merida had bought in the summer of 1984, in the first year of their marriage, when Ansel had been 20 and Merida had been 19, and they had both been fresh out of Absaroka High School, and had, in the reckless way of a pair of young people from a small Montana town, gone to a bank in Billings and had taken out a 30-year mortgage on a house they could not really afford but had wanted anyway. He had paid off the mortgage in 2014. Merida had lived in the house with him for 39 years. She had died on the 22nd of October, 2023, in the hospice at the Beartooth Billings Clinic, of the pancreatic cancer that she had been diagnosed with in the January of that year and had lived with for 9 months, and had at the end gone gently with, holding his hand, in the late afternoon with the October light on the hospital window. He had been alone in the house since. He had been up since 2:30 that morning. He often was. He had trouble sleeping. He had had trouble sleeping since Merida had died. He kept a schedule that let him be up in the small hours if he wanted to. He kept coffee in a thermos on the desk. He kept the room dark, except for the low glow of his equipment lights and the reading lamp over the logbook. The radio equipment took up the east wall of the room. He had built it up over 4 decades. The centerpiece was a Kenwood TS-590SG transceiver he had bought in 2015, on the occasion of his 51st birthday, when Merida had given him the down payment as a gift. Around the transceiver were the accessories he had accumulated: an external antenna tuner, a power supply, a stir meter, a set of headphones, a microphone, a stack of logbooks on the shelf above the desk, a rotary control for the antenna outside, which was a hex beam on a 55-foot tower in the backyard. He was tuning the shortwave. He was on the 14 megahertz band, doing a slow sweep through the quiet part of the band just above the amateur allocation. He was not looking for anything in particular. He was doing what he had done every morning for 44 years, turning the dial slowly and listening to what the ionosphere was, pushing his way from the bounce points around the world. The band was the quiet of the small hours. There was a weak signal on 14.220 from a station in Australia, someone doing a rag shoe with a station in California. There was the hiss of an empty patch of the band up around 14.250. There was nothing much else. At 3:47, he came across a signal on a frequency of 14.287 megahertz. It was a voice. The voice was a woman's voice. It was calm. It was reading numbers, she said in English, in the unaccented monotone of a person who was reading numbers into a microphone as a job. 3729418624739. She paused. She said, "Repeat, 3729418624739. She paused again. She said, "End of transmission." The signal went to dead air. Ansel sat in his chair. He was, on the reckoning of a man who had been on the amateur bands for 44 years, aware of what he had just heard. He had heard a number station. Number stations were, in the history of the shortwave, a category of broadcasts that had appeared on unassigned frequencies since the Cold War. They were widely believed to be one-way transmissions from intelligence agencies to field agents. The messages were encoded numbers. The pattern of the transmissions was consistent. A voice, usually a woman's, reading numbers in a slow monotone, sometimes with a preceding musical cue or a preceding call sign. The identities of the stations had never been officially confirmed. They had been cataloged by amateur enthusiasts for decades. The most famous stations had names: Lincolnshire Poacher, Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, The Buzzer, The Swedish Rhapsody. Ansel knew about number stations. He had picked one up before, in the 90s, on a different frequency. A station that was cataloged by the enthusiasts as HM01, believed to be Cuban. He had listened to it for about 20 minutes. It had been a woman speaking in Spanish, reading 5-digit groups in a slow way. He had made a log entry, had checked the frequency against the enthusiast database in a published guide he had at the time, had confirmed the identity, and had moved on. He had not thought much about it since. This station was different. It was not on a catalog frequency. It was in unaccented American English. It was reading a 13-digit sequence rather than the typical 5-digit groups. It had ended with end of transmission rather than the more common musical cue or interval signal. He wrote down the frequency in his logbook. He wrote down the time. He wrote down the numbers. He noted that the voice was a female voice in unaccented American English. He noted the transmission had ended with end of transmission rather than the more common musical cue or interval signal. He sat at the desk for a while. Then he made himself a fresh cup of coffee. He walked out of the radio room, through the small hallway, into the kitchen. The kitchen was the kitchen Merida had made her own over the 39 years of their marriage. Her curtains still hung on the window over the sink. Her dish towels still hung on the bar by the stove. Her spice rack was still on the wall by the pantry door. Ansel had not moved any of it since she had died. He had not, in the 3 years since, been able to bring himself to. He poured his coffee. He walked back to the radio room. The frequency was quiet. He listened for about 20 more minutes. Nothing came back on. He went to bed at 5. He did not sleep. He went back to the radio room the next night. He set an alarm for 3:30. At 3:40, he sat at the desk with his coffee and tuned to 14.287. At 3:47, the voice came on. 1894276538119. Pause. Repeat. 1894276538119. Pause. End of transmission. The signal went to dead air. Ansel wrote it down. He did it again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. For 11 nights, he sat at the desk at 3:40 and listened to the voice on 14.287 read a 13-digit sequence. For 11 nights, the sequence was different each night. For 11 nights, the transmission was at 3:47 exactly. For 11 nights, it lasted about 40 seconds. For 11 nights, the voice was the same voice. By the 11th night, on the 14th of October, Ansel had a page in his logbook with 11 13-digit sequences and the times of the transmissions, and a set of notes on the propagation conditions. He looked at the page. He thought. He was, on the reckoning of a man of 62, who had been an amateur radio operator for 44 years, and had also been, in his working life, an insurance actuary for a firm in Billings for 31 years before his retirement. A man who was reasonably good, with numbers. He looked at the sequences. He thought about what a 13-digit sequence could be. He thought about coordinates. Latitude and longitude in decimal degrees to 7 decimal places would use 14 digits, not 13. To 6 decimal places would use 12, not 13. He thought about dates. A date in the format MMDIE would be 8 digits, not 13. He thought about phone numbers. A 13-digit number would fit a country code plus a phone number. But there was no country with the first digit patterns he was seeing. He thought about ISBNs, about serial numbers, about lottery draws, about the formats that 13-digit sequences appeared in. He fought. He wrote down the 11 sequences in a column on a page in his logbook. He looked at them for a long time. Then he saw it. The first 6 digits of each sequence, if you inserted separators, were dates. 2 digits for the month, 2 for the day, 2 for the year. The first sequence was 372941, which could be March 7th, 1929-41, but that was 7 digits, or 030729/41. Ansel thought about it. Then he thought, what if it was 3 digits for the year? So the century was implied by the reader. 371941, March 7th, 1941, he wrote it out. March 7th, 1941, the next 7 digits in the sequence were 8624739. He looked at those. He thought about coordinates again. Latitude and longitude. Latitude 86, no, latitude and longitude in a shorter format. He looked at his own coordinates. Absaroki, Montana, was at latitude 45. 5 degrees north. Longitude 109.4 degrees west. If you rounded, 45 north, 109 west. The next 7 digits were 8624739. He looked at that. He wrote 45 degrees, 3 minutes, 20 seconds north. That would be 6 digits, 450320. Plus longitude 109 degrees, 27 minutes, 39 seconds west. That would be 6 digits, 1092739. Together 12 digits. The number in the sequence was 7 digits, 8624739. He thought about it. He thought, what if the coordinates were in a different format? What if they were latitude only in a format? He tried a different decoding. 2 digits for the latitude degrees, 2 digits for the minutes, 2 digits for the seconds. That was 6 digits. The 7th digit could be N or S encoded as a number. He looked at 8624739. 8624739, he looked at it a long time. Then he wrote it out as 86 degrees, 24 minutes, 73,009 seconds, which was not a valid coordinate. Seconds could not be more than 60. He tried 8 degrees, 6 minutes, 24 seconds. 739 could be tenths of a second. That was 8 degrees, 6 minutes, 24,739 seconds. That was a valid latitude, but it wasn't near Montana. 8 degrees north or south was equatorial. He thought about it. He thought. He tried another interpretation. He tried. The numbers could be a date and a latitude in one very format he had used at his insurance firm. In actuarial work, some data sets were coded with dates as day, month, year, and coordinates in a decimal format truncated to 7 digits. He tried 8.62473 in decimal degree format, ignoring the last 9. 8.62473 degrees. He looked at that. He got out an atlas from his shelf. He looked up 8.62473 north. 8.62473 degrees north was in the Gulf of Panama. That was not where he had been on March 7, 1941. He had not been anywhere on March 7, 1941. He had been born in 1964. He had not been born yet. He put the atlas down, he thought. He tried the other sequences. The second sequence was 1894276538119. He split it, 1894227 as date, 6538119 as another number. 189427. He looked at it. If the format was MMD, that was month 18, day 94. Not a valid date. If the format was YMMD, that was year 189, month 42. Not valid. If the format was different, say YMMD is 222, that was 1894-27, or 1894 is year, 27 is no. 1894 is year, then 27 is month day, would need more parsing. He tried YMMD 1894-27 as year. He tried DMMYA 1894-27, month 94, invalid. He looked at 189427. 1894, February 7th. 1894-27, he looked at that. Then he looked at the rest of the sequence, 6538119, 6538119, 65.38119, or 65.38119 north. 65.38119 north was in interior Alaska. He looked at that. He got the atlas again. He looked up 65.38119 north. That coordinate, without a longitude, was a parallel that ran across Alaska, across Siberia, across Scandinavia. It was not a location. But the first sequence had also been a partial. It had had 6 of 7 digits, interpretable as a decimal latitude, 8,62473, with a hanging 9. He thought about that. He looked at the sequences again. He wrote each one out as date followed by a 7-digit latitude like number. Sequence 1, March 7th, 1941, latitude something 8.624739. Sequence 2, February 7th, 1894, latitude something 65.38119. Sequence 3, October 19th, 1972, latitude something 4722816. He looked at the sequences. He thought. Then he thought, what if the first digit of the 7-digit number was not part of a latitude at all? What if the first digit was a longitude prefix, something like 108 for a Montana longitude? He tried it. Sequence 1, date, 3/7/1941, first digit 1, then 08.624739. The 9 at the end could be another prefix, or a check digit, or something else. But longitude 108. 62473 west was in, he checked the atlas, 108,62473 west at some latitude. Central Montana was around 109 west. 108,62473 was slightly east of Absaroki. In fact, 108.62473 west at 45.5 north was near a spot on the Yellowstone River just outside of Billings. Ansel stopped. He looked at the atlas. He looked at the sequence again. He thought, what if the 7-digit number was actually a longitude, and the trailing digit was the latitude to 1-digit precision? Sequence 1, March 7th, 1941, longitude 108.62473, latitude prefix 9. Prefix 9 didn't work as a full latitude, neither did just 9. But if the trailing digit was the digit for the tens of degrees of latitude, then latitude 4-something, which for a longitude of 108 west would put you in Montana at around 4-something north 40s. He tried it another way. The 7 digits could be encoded differently. He got a piece of paper. He wrote out sequence 1 very carefully. March 7, 1941, 8624739. He wrote it as 8.6247 latitude, 39/10 of degrees longitude. He wrote 8.6247 north, 39 west. That was in the Gulf of Guinea. Not helpful. He wrote 8.6247 south, 39 west. That was somewhere in Brazil. He wrote 86.247 degrees, 3.9 degrees. 86 north was the Arctic. He tried the sequences a different way. He wrote out each sequence in a table. 13 columns. He filled in the 11 rows. He looked at the columns. The first 6 columns he had established were dates in some format. The last 7 columns he was still working on. He looked at the last 7 columns. Then he saw something. The 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th columns had a pattern to them. The digits in those columns, taken by themselves, were increasing. Slowly, over the 11 rows, they were, on average, going up. He looked at the numbers. Column 7, row 1, was 8. Column 7, row 11, was 4, not a monotone increase. But the average of the first 3 rows was different from the average of the last 3 rows. He calculated. He got average of first 3, 50. Average of last 3, 4007. Not really increasing. He looked at column 8. First 3 average 6.0, last 3 5.7. Also not really. He tried column 9. First 3 average 4, 7. Last 3 4.3. He tried column 10. First 3 average 4.7, last 3 4.7. Steady, he tried something else. He took the last 7 digits of each sequence and treated them as a single 7-digit integer. He wrote out the integers. 8624739, 6538119, 47222816, and so on. He looked at the integers. Then he saw it. The integers were not random. They were, on inspection, sorted, in order, from largest to smallest, across the 11 rows. Sequence 1, 8624739, sequence 2, 6538119, sequence 3, 47222816, sequence 4, 4211039, sequence 5, 3892471, sequence 6, 3251826, sequence 7, 2917304, sequence 9, 1926384, sequence 10, 1425076, sequence 11, 924381. They were decreasing. He looked at them. He looked at the dates in the first 6 digits of each. The dates were increasing. The first sequence had been March 7th, 1941. The second had been February 7th, 1894, but that was going backward. He rechecked. Sequence 1, digits 1 through 6, 372941. As mm to y, that was March 7th, 1941, if yy was 41. Sequence 2, digits 1 through 6, 189427. As mm dy, that could be January 8th, 1994. Or perhaps, as YMMD, 1894-27 wasn't valid. Or maybe the format was different. He looked at it again. If the first 6 digits were interpreted as MDY, with the leading 0 of the month dropped, then sequence 2, 189427 was January 8th, 1994, and the extra digit 27 was the beginning of something else. That would make the format irregular. Some dates would use 6 digits and some 7. Depending on whether the month was 1 or 2 digits. He tried that. Sequence 1, 372941 could be March 7th, 2941. No, that was future. Or March 7 in a 2-digit year 29. Then 41 as first 2 digits of the 7-digit tail. But he had been assuming the last 7 digits were the coordinate. He rethought. Maybe the format was, first digit is the length of the date field. If the first digit was 3, then the date used the next 3 digits, 7, 2, 9, which could be month 7, day 29. If the first digit was 1, then the date used the next digit only. That didn't work either. Too irregular. He set the sequences aside. He went and got another cup of coffee. He sat at the desk. He thought about the sequences. The last 7 digits were decreasing across the transmissions. That was a pattern. The first 6 digits had some kind of date-like quality, but he could not get a consistent format. He thought about it. Then he wrote down all 11 sequences in a single line, each after the other, with no breaks. He got 372941862473918942776538167172894425769243881. He looked at it. He thought. Then he counted the digits. There were more than 130, which was correct for 11 sequences of 13 digits each, 143. He looked for repeating substrings. He looked for anything that suggested a pattern. He did not find anything. He was, at 4:58 in the morning of the 15th of October, tired. He went to bed. He did not go to the radio room the next night. He went the night after. At 3:40, he sat at the desk. At 3:47, the voice came on. He wrote down the sequence. Sequence 12, 521864, 3921736. He added it to his logbook. He tried the decoding one more time. He tried treating the first 4 digits as MMY, so 5218 was May 2018. Then the next 2 digits DD64, which was invalid as a day. That failed. He tried treating the first two as day, next two as month, next two as year, 52-18-64, which was invalid, day 52. Failed. He was stuck. He set the logbook aside. He went about his day. That afternoon, he drove into Absaroki to the hardware store on Main Street to pick up a fluorescent bulb for the fixture in his radio room that had gone out. He drove back. He installed the bulb. It worked. That evening, he sat in his living room. The living room was the living room Merida had made her own. She had, over the 39 years, put in the overstuffed couch and the pair of overstuffed chairs, the coffee table Ansel's brother in Bozeman had made for them as a wedding gift, the rag rug on the hardwood floor, the old roll-top desk in the corner where Merida had done the household accounts, the tall bookshelf on the west wall. Ansel had, since Merida had died, gone in the evenings to sit in the armchair on the east side of the living room, the one that had been Merida's chair, with a book in his lap, and had spent the hours between supper and bed there. He had read most of the way through the set of history books he had accumulated over the years, and had never quite gotten to when Merida was alive. He was reading, that evening, a book about the history of Marconi's early experiments in transatlantic wireless. He came to a paragraph about Marconi's transmissions from Poldhu in Cornwall in 1901. The book described the signals Marconi had sent, the letter S, in Morse, 3 dots, over and over. Ansel put the book down. He thought. Then he went to the radio room. He got out his logbook. He looked at sequence 12 again. 5218643921736. He tried treating each digit as an encoded letter. 1 equals A, 2 equals B, and so on. 0 being some other character. 5 was E, 2 was B, 1 was A, 8 was H, 6 was F, 4 was D, 3 was C, 9 was I, 2 was B, 1 was A, 7 was G, 3 was C, 6 was F. He boxed the book shift. That was not English. He tried another cipher. Each pair of digits. 52, 18, 64, 39, 21, 73, 6. 52, 18, 64, 39, 21, 73, 6. If those were letters in a modular way, 52 mod 26 was 0, which was Z. 18 was R. 64 mod 26 was 12, which was L. 39 mod 26 was 13, which was M. 21 was U. 73 mod 26 was 21, which was U. 6 was F. Zerlmuth, not English. He tried other groupings. Nothing. He went to bed at midnight. For the next 2 weeks, Ansel got up at 3:30 every morning. Every morning at 3:47, he received the transmission. Every morning, he wrote down the sequence. He now had 26 sequences. The 7-digit tails were still decreasing. Sequence 26 had a tail of 216840, which was 6 digits, not 7. He looked at it. He looked at all 26 sequences.
The tails were 8624739, 4538816, 4720101, Fran 3892471, 3251826, 2917330, 23846 312, 1928471, 4244076, 14250638446, 684108184, 168418448, 26418687174, 192183744, 361721 and more, 3695371 and more, 31168420. The last one, 21680, was 6 digits. He looked at the sequence 52188642168 and so 12 digits, not 13.
The transmission that morning had been a digit shorter than the others. He had verified. He had listened to the tape he had made. The voice had read 12 digits. He looked at the sequence. 12 digits. If the first 6 were the date and the last 6 were the tail, then date 521864. In some format, tail 216840. He tried MMDIE on the date. Month 5, day 2, year 1864. May 2 1864. He looked at that. May 2 1864, he knew that date. He had, in his amateur radio hobby, learned the dates of early telegraph messages. May 2 1864 was a date in the history of the Civil War telegraphs. But the 7 other sequences with decreasing tails, when rechecked, could not be decoded with the same MMDIE format. He was tired. He sat at his desk. He looked at the sequence 26, May 2nd, 1864, then 216840. Then he thought, What if the number after the date was a person's identifier of some kind? A serial number? A name? He thought about names. He thought about his own name. Ansel Torvik. Anseltorvik. 12 letters counting the space. 11 letters not counting the space. He looked at the sequence. 216840. 6 digits. He converted each digit to a letter by the position and alphabet method he had tried before. 2 was B, 1 was A, 6 was F, 8 was H, 4 was D, 0 was nothing or a character. Baft, that was not his name. He tried different mappings, each digit to a letter in various rotations of the alphabet. Nothing worked. He sat at his desk. He thought. Then he thought, what if it wasn't a code at all? What if the numbers were the answer to a question? What if they were just numbers? He thought about what the numbers could just be. Then he did something he had not done in the 7 months of listening. He went to the bookshelf in his living room where his personal papers were kept. He got out an accordion folder. In it was his family history binder, a document that Merida had put together over the last 10 years of her life as a genealogy project, tracking his family and hers back to the late 1700s. Merida had loved the project. She had spent, in the years after Ansel had retired from his actuarial job, and before her diagnosis, many weekend afternoons at the microfilm reader in the small library in Apsaro Key, going through census records and parish registers and immigration lists. She had, on visits to Norway to see Ansel's cousins in Trondheim, spent full days in the archives there, tracking the Torvik line back to the parish of Kvenver on Hitra Island in the 1700s. She had built out a tree with about 400 entries in it. She had, in the last months of her life, when she had known she was dying and had wanted to leave things in order for Ansel, printed out the whole tree and put it in the accordion folder with her summary notes and had given it to him. He had, in the 3 years since, opened it once, at the funeral reception when Merida's sister from Livingston had asked to see it. He brought it back to the radio room. He opened it to the page for his own family, the Torviks. He looked at his father's entry. Bjornstjerne Torvik, born January 8, 1927, died December 3, 1994. He looked at his mother's entry. Meredith Halstead Torvik, born September 15, 1930, died February 4, 2006. He looked at his grandfather's entry. Ivar Torvik, born May 22, 1899, in Christiania, Norway, emigrated to America 1922. Died August 11, 1968, in Butte, Montana. He looked at his great-grandfather. Jens Torvik, born March 7, 1876, in Trondheim, Norway, died June 18, 1941, in Trondheim. Ansel stopped. He looked at Jens Torvik's dates. Born March 7, 1876, he looked at sequence 1. He had decoded the first 6 digits as MMDDY, giving March 7, 1941. But if the format was MMDD, followed by YI as the last 2 digits of a birth year in the 1800s, if the reader was assuming the century was 18-something, then 372941 could be March 7th, 18 with 29-something, then 41. No, that didn't work cleanly. But he looked at the tail. 8624739, 9 at the end. Great-grandfather Jens Torvik, born March 7, 1876, died June 18, 1941. The date at the end of sequence 1 had been 41. 1941, Jens had died in 1941. Ansel sat. He looked at the sequence. He looked at the family tree. He looked at the sequence again. He put together on a piece of paper a new interpretation. Sequence 1, 37294186244739. He tried. 37. Then 29. Then 41. Then 8624739. He looked at Jens's dates. Born March 7th, 1876, died June 18th, 1941, age of death 65. Then he thought, what if the sequence was not 2 things, but was 3 things? Sequence 1, 37, then 29, then 41, then 8624739. He looked at 29. As days from birth month to death month, maybe? Jens was born March 7, died June 18. From March 7 to June 18 was 103 days, not 29. He tried another parse. 3729 is March 7th, 29 for some year. He tried yet another, 372941. He set that aside. He looked at the last 7 digits, 86244739. He looked at Jens's death date. June 18th, 1941, he wrote, 618, which would be 618, which was 3 digits. He thought, what if the tail was another date? Death date, 6 digits, 061841, or 6181941, which was 7 digits. He looked at the tail, 8624739. He tried 61841. That was 5 digits, 61841. Plus 2 more, 8 and 6 and 2 and 4 and 7 and 3 and 9. That was 7, not 5. He tried rearranging 8, 624, 73, 9. 8, 624, he was reaching. He put the tree down. He sat at his desk. He thought. Then he tried something different. He looked at the tail, 8624739, as an 8-digit number missing 1 digit, 8624739, or as a 9-digit number missing 2, 8624739. He tried the date Jens had died, June 18th, 1941, which could be written 6/18/1941, 7 digits with no leading 0 on the month. The tail was 8624739, 7 digits. If he took Jens's death date and reformatted it, 06/18/1941 was 8 digits. Without leading 0, 6/18/1941 was 7. Compare 6181941 with 8624739. Not a match. He tried Jens's birth date, March 7th, 1876, 3/7/1876. 7 digits. Compare 371876 with 8624739. Not a match. He tried Jens's death date in Norwegian date format, 18/6/1941. 8 digits. Not a match. He was tired. He set the logbook and the tree aside. He went to bed at midnight. For the next 2 weeks, Ansel got up at 3:30 every morning. By the end of November, Ansel had 91 sequences in his logbook. He had not decoded them. He was aware, on the reckoning of a man who had spent 44 years at the amateur bands and had spent 31 years in an actuarial office in Billings, that he might never decode them. He was aware that whoever was broadcasting was patient. They had broadcast for at least 91 nights. They would broadcast for more nights. They were prepared to wait for as long as it took him to understand. He was aware, in the way of a man who had come to consider that he might be the only person in the world hearing this transmission, that whoever was broadcasting might not care whether he understood. They might just want him to listen. They might just want him to know that they were there. He kept listening. Every morning at 3:40. Every morning the coffee in the thermos. Every morning the logbook. Every morning the voice at 3:47. In late November, he did something he had not done in the 7 weeks of listening. He took the logbook to the small shortwave radio club he had been a member of for the last 12 years, the Yellowstone Valley Amateur Radio Group, which met on the second Saturday of the month at a meeting room at the American Legion Post in Columbus, Montana. He brought the logbook with him to the November meeting. There were 9 members present that day. The president of the group, a man named Werner Fosberg, who was 75 and had been on the amateur bands for 60 years. The vice president, a woman named Aleni Larvik, who was 58 and taught electronics at the community college in Billings. The other 7 were the handful of regulars. At the end of the meeting, Ansel raised his hand. Werner said, "Ansel." Ansel said, "Werner, I have something. I do not know what to make of it. I want to ask the group." Werner said, "Go ahead." Ansel said, "For the last 7 weeks, I have been receiving a number station on 14.287 megahertz at 3:47 a.m. Mountain Time, every morning. Female voice, unaccented American English. 13-digit sequences, mostly. I have been logging them." Werner said, "Ansel, 14.287 is in the 20-meter band. That's the amateur allocation. That is not where number stations broadcast." Ansel said, "I know." Aleni said, "Have you triangulated?" Ansel said, "I have not." I would need a second station somewhere else in the country listening at the same time to triangulate. I do not have that. Werner said, have you contacted the Enigma group? They catalog number stations. Ansel said, I have not. Werner said, you should. If it is a new station, they would want to know. Ansel said, Werner said, yes. Ansel said, I do not know if I want them to know. I have been thinking about it. I have been thinking that the broadcast might be for me. There was a pause in the room. Werner said, Ansel. Ansel said, I know how it sounds. Aline said, Ansel, number stations are not for individuals. They are for classes of agents. That is how they work. Ansel said, I know. But this one is on a different pattern. It is on an amateur frequency. It is at exactly 3:47 every morning, which is when I am usually at the desk. It is unaccented American English. The sequences are 13 digits, which does not match any catalog station. Alini said, have you tried triangulating with a member of the group? Ansel said, I have not. Alini said, I could listen tomorrow morning. Ansel said, Alini, I would appreciate that. Alini said, I will listen at 3:47 your time. 14.287. I will log what I hear. I will call you tomorrow afternoon. Ansel said, thank you. The meeting broke up. Ansel drove home to Absaroki. That night he went to the radio room at 3:30. At 3:47 the voice came on. He'd read the sequence. Ansel wrote it down. He waited. The next afternoon at 2 Alini called him. Alini said, Ansel. Ansel said, Alini. Alini said, I listened at 3:47 this morning on 14.287. Ansel said, what did you hear? Alini said, nothing, Ansel. I heard nothing. I heard the band noise. I listened for 15 minutes. There was no transmission on 14.287 at 3:47 a.m. Mountain Time. Ansel was quiet. He said, Alini. Alini said, Ansel. Ansel said, are you sure? Alini said, I am sure. I recorded the 15 minutes. I can play it back for you. There is no voice. There are no numbers. There is nothing. Ansel said, thank you, Alini. Alini said, Ansel. Ansel said, yes. Alini said, are you all right? Ansel said, I don't know. Alini said, Ansel, would you like me to come out to Absaroki? Ansel said, no, I am all right. Thank you, Alini, she said. Ansel, call me if you need to. He said, I will. He hung up. He sat in the kitchen. He sat for a long time. Then he went to the radio room. He looked at the logbook. 92 sequences. He thought about what Alini had told him. Alini had a rig in Billings that was, on any reasonable measure, more sensitive than Ansel's. If Ansel's rig could pick up a signal on 14.287 at 3:47, then Alini's rig, 70 miles away, should have picked up the same signal. Unless the signal was very local. Unless the signal was on the reckoning. So local as to be arriving only at Ansel's rig in Ansel's radio room in Ansel's house on the edge of Absaroki. He thought about that. He thought about it for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in the 7 months. He turned on his tape recorder. He set it to record. He waited until 3:47 the next morning. The voice came on. The voice said the sequence. The voice ended. Ansel stopped the tape. He rewound the tape. He played it back. The tape was silent. The tape recorder that had been running for the full transmission and that had picked up the sound of Ansel's own breathing in the room and the sound of the electric clock on the wall and the hum of the band noise on the frequency had not picked up the voice. The voice was not on the tape. Ansel sat at the desk. He listened to the tape again. He listened to the tape 3 more times. There was no voice. He looked at his logbook. 93 sequences. He looked at his tape recorder. He looked at the place on the wall where the reading lamp threw the circle of light onto the logbook. He looked around the radio room, in the low-lit dark, at the equipment that had been his companion for 44 years, at the chair Merida had bought him for the 50th birthday in 1914, at the stack of logbooks above the desk, at the coffee thermos that had held his coffee for the last thousands of mornings. He said out loud, in the low-lit dark, "Merida." The room was quiet. He said, "Merida, is that you?" The room was quiet. He said, "Merida, if it is you, I want you to know I am listening. I have been listening. I do not care what the numbers mean. I do not need to know what the numbers mean. I just want you to know that I am listening, and that I am here, and that I have been here every morning." The room was quiet, but the quiet was not the quiet of an empty room. It was the quiet of a room in which someone else was listening. Ansel sat at his desk. He did not cry. He was on the reckoning of a man who had cried very little in the 3 years since Merida had died, who had, in the way of a man of his generation and background, held his grief tight and inside, dry-eyed in the low-lit dark of his radio room at 4 in the morning of the 4th of December, 2026. He said, "Merida, I miss you. I am glad you are here." The room was quiet. He sat for a long time. Then he got up. He went to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of coffee at the counter Merida had chosen the green tile for in the summer of 1989. He drank it standing at the window over the sink, looking out at the dark of the yard, at the first snow of the season that had come the night before. He went back to the radio room. He sat at the desk. He said, "Merida, I will be here at 3:47 tomorrow. If you want to say more, I will be here." The room was quiet. Ansel went to bed at 5:30. He slept. He slept the deep sleep of a man who had, for the first time in 3 years, gone to bed knowing he was not alone in the house. He continued to listen. The transmissions continued. Every morning at 3:47, on 14.287 megahertz, the voice read a sequence. Some sequences were 12 digits. Some were 13. Some were 15. Some were 9. By the end of the following March, Ansel had 217 sequences in his logbook. He had not decoded them. He had come, in the quiet way, to understand that he was not meant to decode them. He was meant to listen. That was what Merida, or whatever was calling itself Merida, on his rig in his radio room at 3:47 every morning, wanted. She wanted him to be at the desk. She wanted him to have the thermos of coffee. She wanted him to have the log book open and the pencil in his hand. She wanted him to be listening. That was the companionship she was able to offer him now, in the place she was in. And he was able to offer her, in the place he was in, the listening. He did not tell Aline. He did not tell Werner. He did not tell the Yellowstone Valley Amateur Radio Group. He did not tell his sister in Bozeman. He did not tell his son in Missoula. He was, on the outside reckoning, an old man alone in a house in Absaroka, Montana, doing a hobby. He was, on the inside reckoning, in touch with something that was broadcasting to him at 3:47 every morning on 14.287 megahertz. And that had been broadcasting to him for the better part of a year now. And that would broadcast to him for as long as she, or it, was able to. That was enough. He was going to keep listening. For as long as they broadcast. For the rest of his life, if it took the rest of his life. That was the work. He was going to do it well. Bramwell Hollister was 47 years old and had been a cave surveyor with the National Speleological Society for 22 years. And on the 4th of March, 2026, he was on the third day of a solo survey trip into an unmapped section of the Wyandotte Cave system in southern Indiana, when he found a chamber that he was not going to put on the map. He had been in the cave for 11 hours that day. The Wyandotte system was one of the older mapped caves in the karst country of Indiana. The main section had been known since the 1800s. There was a stretch of the main passage, the stretch that had been the commercial tour cave from about 1850 until the 1960s, where the lantern smoke of the 19th century tour guides was still faintly on the ceiling. Wyandotte had been given to the state of Indiana in the 1960s and had been a state park property since. The main cave was still a tour cave. A ranger led groups through the commercial section on the hourly schedule from April through October. The rest of the cave system, extending from the back of the tour section out into the limestone country of Crawford County, was open to permitted survey and exploration by members of the caving groups that had access agreements with the state. In the 22 years Bramwell had been surveying, the mapped extent had grown from about 25 miles to just over 60. The new mapping was the slow work of a small handful of surveyors, most of them affiliated with the NSA, working weekends and holidays. Bramwell had been in the cave 3 times a year for 8 years. He had contributed about 1.5 miles to the map in that time. The current trip was a 3-day solo effort, focused on a side passage in the northern part of the cave that had been noted by a previous surveyor as continuing beyond the last survey station, but had not been pushed. The previous surveyor was a woman named Kestra Baum. She was a friend of Bramwell's. She was, in fact, his closest friend in the Ness. She had been his surveying partner on many trips. She had, in the previous November, been in the Northern Passage with her partner, Nave Hallett, and had run survey 480 feet along the passage before turning back at the end of the weekend they had been on. She had noted in the trip report she had filed with the NSS in December that the passage continued beyond her last station, that it was in good condition, that the stream running along the eastern wall was small but reliable, and that the passage looked like it might go a very long way. She had recommended a follow-up trip. Bramwell had, in January, volunteered for it. Kestra had, in an email, thanked him. She had said she and Nee could not get out to Indiana until May. She had said that if Bramwell wanted to push it solo in March, please to do so, and please to be careful, and please to check in with her when he got out. Bramwell had said he would. He had entered the cave on Sunday morning. The entrance to the Northern Passage was through a side door in the commercial section, a gate that the state park kept locked, and to which the caving groups had keys. Bramwell had let himself in at 8 a.m. He had walked through the dark of the commercial section. The tour lights were off since it was March and outside of the commercial tour season, and had come to the back of the tour route and had gone through the second gate into the undeveloped cave beyond. He had cached his gear at the bivouac site the previous surveyor had used, at survey station N747, about 4 hours in. He had spent Sunday and Monday extending the survey another 680 feet along the side passage. The passage was, on the reckoning of a surveyor of 22 years, a good passage. It had steady dimensions of about 6 feet wide by 4 feet high. The floor was mostly dry silt, with a small stream running along the eastern wall. There were formations, flowstone on the ceiling in some sections, some helictites on the west wall. It was a clean cave passage of the kind that a surveyor was pleased to be in. It also had, on the reckoning of a surveyor of 22 years, the quality of a passage that had been undisturbed for a very long time. There were no footprints in the silt. There were no ropes left by previous surveyors. There were no carbon streaks on the walls from previous lamps. The passage was, on the look, virgin. That was not surprising. Kestra had said it looked like it might go a very long way. Bramwell had been in caves before, where a passage had opened up beyond a pinch, and had gone for miles into virgin territory. That was one of the reasons a surveyor kept surveying, for the chance of pushing into Virgin Cave. He had, on Sunday and Monday, been the third human being to enter that passage, and he had been the first to push it past station N770. On Tuesday morning at 7:15, he had set out from the bivouac to push the passage further. He had reached his previous last survey station at 7:40. He had run survey for 320 more feet through Tuesday morning. At about 11, he had come to a breakdown pile that partially blocked the passage. The breakdown pile was old. He could see that on the look of it. The stones of the pile had a calcite coating from long-term water drip in the passage. The coating was thin but visible. Breakdown that had happened recently, within, say, the last few hundred years, would not have accumulated a coating like that. The pile had been in the passage for a long time. He had spent an hour finding a route through the breakdown, crawling on his belly for about 80 feet through a chest-tight crawlway on the east side of the pile. The crawlway was tight enough that he had to remove his helmet and push it ahead of him, in the way a surveyor learned to push a helmet ahead in the tight crawls. He had scraped his shoulder on the ceiling in one spot. He had, at one point, been in a spot where he had to rotate his hips 90 degrees to fit through a narrowing in the crawlway. He had, on the reckoning of a surveyor of 22 years, been in tighter crawls before, but not many. The floor of the crawlway was cool limestone under his belly, damp in places from the small stream in the passage that had, over the millennia, worked its way partway under the breakdown pile. The air in the crawlway was still. It smelled the way undisturbed cave passages smell. The mineral smell of the wet limestone. The quiet smell of the air that has been in one place a long time. There was no smell of animal in the air. No smell of decomposition. No smell of anything that might once have been living. Just the mineral smell of the stone and the wet. At about the 60-foot mark of the crawlway, he had come to a tight spot where the ceiling and the floor came to within about 11 inches of each other. He had, at that point, exhaled fully to flatten his chest, and had pushed himself through the tight spot on his exhale, and had inhaled again on the far side. He had done that kind of thing before. He had not liked it any better this time than any other time. At about the 70-foot mark, he had felt the crawlway begin to widen. At the 78-foot mark, his helmet lamp, which he was still pushing ahead of him on the floor, had lit up a space beyond the crawlway that was larger than the crawlway. That was the chamber. He had crawled out of the crawlway into the chamber. He had put his helmet back on. He had stood up. On the far side of the breakdown, he had come out into a chamber. The chamber was about 40 feet long, 20 wide, and 15 high. The chamber was, on the look of it, Virgin Cave. No footprints, no survey markers, no signs of previous human visitors. Bramwell had stood in the entrance of the chamber for a moment with his helmet lamp on. He had run the beam over the floor. He had seen the cairns. There were 7 of them, arranged in a rough circle in the center of the chamber floor. Each cairn was made of loose limestone rocks, stacked to about knee height. The rocks were the limestone of the local cave, nothing carried in from outside. Bramwell had walked slowly toward the cairns. He had stopped about 8 feet from the nearest one. He had run his beam over it. The cairn was old. The stones had a patina of cave mineral deposit on their surfaces that came from a very long time in a stable cave environment. Water dripping from a point above had, over centuries, laid a thin coat of calcite over the top stones of the cairns. In places, the coat was thick enough that it had glued stones together. Bramwell had, in his 22 years, seen cairns like this exactly twice. Both times had been in caves in France that had been photographed and dated by archaeologists. The cairns had been dated to between 8 and 12,000 years old. Bramwell had crouched down beside the nearest cairn. He had not touched it. He had looked at it a long time. The cairn was made of 9 stones. 9 limestone stones, the largest at the base, about the size of a small loaf of bread, the smallest at the top, about the size of a lemon. The stones had been chosen, on the look of the pile, for their shapes, the base stones flat-topped and stable, the middle stones round enough to nest into the flat tops without rolling off, the top stones small enough to balance on the middle stones without pushing the whole pile out of true. The pile had been made by someone who had made a pile of stones before, someone who knew the work. The calcite deposit on the top of the pile was thickest at the very top and thinnest at the base, which meant the drip point in the ceiling above had been directly over the top of the pile, and the water had run down the sides of the pile over the centuries and had thinned as it had gone. The drip point above was still active. Bramwell could see, when he tilted his helmet lamp up, the small wet mark on the ceiling, where the water was still coming through the limestone, in the same place it had been coming through for however many thousand years the pile had been sitting under it. Every drop of that water had fallen onto that cairn. Every drop had left the smallest possible film of dissolved mineral on the stones. Over 10,000 years, those films had built to what he was looking at now. He counted the cairns. 7. He looked at the arrangement. The 7 cairns were in a rough circle about 12 feet across. Not a perfect circle. The circle had a slight flatness on one side, the side facing the far wall with the notch, as if the 7 cairns had been arranged so that they faced the wall together, and so that a person sitting between the cairns and the wall could have been looked at by all 7 of them at once. Or as if the 7 cairns were 7 people sitting around a fire, and the fire had been in the flat side of the circle and had faced the wall, except there was no ash. There was no soot in the center of the circle. There had been no fire in the middle of the cairns. Just the 7 cairns arranged so that they looked at the wall. He walked slowly around the circle. He looked at each cairn in turn. They were, on the look, individually built. Each one was a slightly different height. Each one had a slightly different number of stones. The tallest was made of 11 stones and stood about knee-high. The shortest was made of 5 stones and came to just above his ankle. Each had a slightly different shape at the base. Each had been finished at a slightly different quality of workmanship. Some were carefully finished, with the top stones set carefully in place. Some were more rough, as if the person who had built them had been working faster, or with less strength, or with less time. He thought about that. He thought that the tallest and most carefully built cairn had probably been the first, built by someone who had had time and strength and the will to make it right, and that the shortest and roughest had probably been the last, built by someone who was very tired, or very hungry, or very close to dying, or who had had no one left to help, or, and this was the harder thought, that the shortest and roughest cairn had been the last one built for the last person who died, by someone who then had no one to build a cairn for them. He counted the cairns again, 7 cairns. If there had been 8 people, and 7 had built cairns for the 7 who died before them, then the last of the 8 would have no cairn. The last of the 8 would have died beside the last cairn built and would still be there, on the floor of the chamber, 10 or 12,000 years old, in the place where they had lain down. He ran his helmet lamp over the floor around the shortest cairn. There was nothing there. No bones. No cloth. Nothing. But he was, on the reckoning of a cave surveyor of 22 years, aware that after 10,000 years there might not be much of a body left in a cave chamber, even if the body had been laid down and never disturbed. The mineral chemistry of some cave chambers could dissolve bone over long enough time. The microbial activity of some cave chambers could consume the soft tissues within a few years. 10,000 years was a very long time. There might have been an eighth person on the floor of the chamber near the last cairn. He would not know. He walked back to the center of the circle. Along the walls, at about shoulder height, were carbon marks, long streaks of black soot on the pale limestone. He had seen those in caves before, too. They came from torches, from a kind of torch that used pine resin or animal fat. The carbon marks were dense at one place on the north wall of the chamber, as if someone had, over a period of days, kept a torch burning at that spot. The pattern of the smoke was consistent with a torch held in a bracket, or wedged in a notch, or perhaps just leaned against the rock at the base of the wall. He had looked at the marks for a long time. Then he had looked at the far wall of the chamber. The far wall was a smooth face of limestone. It had been worked. There was a worked notch cut into the wall at about waist height, roughly 3 feet wide, 6 inches deep. In the notch were arranged stone objects. He had walked slowly to the notch. He had crouched. The objects were tools. He had seen tools, like these, too. Once, in a photograph of a find in a French cave, the tools were flint. They had been shaped by percussion. They had a patina. They were, on the reckoning of a person who had studied enough cave archaeology to know what he was looking at, likely late Paleolithic, older than the cairns, possibly 10 to 15,000 years old. There were 7 tools in the notch, arranged in a row, each one placed with its working edge facing outward toward the room. 7 tools. 7 cairns. Bramwell had not touched the tools. He had stood up. He had walked back to the center of the chamber. He had looked around. The chamber had one entrance, the crawlway he had come through. It had no other exits that he could see. He had run his beam over every foot of the walls, the ceiling, the floor. No exits, no air movement, no fresh water source, no signs of animal use, no bat guano, no rodent scat, no bones. The chamber was, on the reckoning of a cave surveyor of 22 years, sealed. Sealed off from the main cave system by the breakdown pile in the passage. Sealed off from any other cave system that he could detect. The breakdown pile, on his assessment, was old. The stones on the pile had the same calcite coat as the cairns. The breakdown had happened after the people had come in, and it had sealed them in, and no one had come in or out since. The cairns were arranged in a circle. The tools were in the wall. The people who had made them had been in this chamber. Bramwell had crouched down again, in the center of the circle of cairns. He had turned off his helmet lamp. The chamber had gone entirely black. Bramwell had sat in the dark for a moment. He had been in the dark in caves many times. Every cave surveyor turned off the lamp from time to time. The pure dark of a cave was an experience that could not be had elsewhere. There was no light of any kind. There was no ambient sound. There was, if the surveyor stayed still, only the pulse of the surveyor's own body, the heartbeat, the breath, the quiet ringing that came into the ears in the absence of any other sound. Bramwell had sat in the dark. Then he had felt something. He had felt that he was not alone in the chamber. He had felt it in the way of a person who has been in enough caves to trust his instincts about the state of a cave chamber. Cave surveyors developed over years a sensitivity to the quality of a cave space. Some chambers felt empty. Some chambers felt occupied. Bramwell had, in his 22 years, walked into more than 1,000 cave chambers, and he had learned to trust his read on them. This chamber was occupied. He was, in the pure dark, in the presence of something. The something was, on his read, not human. It was not an animal. It was not a microbial mass or a fungal colony of the kind that some cave chambers hosted. It was something else. It was watching him. He was very still. He was on the reckoning of a man who had been in the dark, alone in caves, many times, aware that his instincts were reliable, and that his instincts were telling him he was in the presence of something. He was also aware that his instincts could not tell him what the something was. He sat in the dark for a while. Then he turned his helmet lamp back on. The chamber was empty. On the look, the cairns, the tools in the wall, the carbon marks. But he was not alone. The presence was there. He stood up slowly. He walked to the crawlway on the east side of the chamber. He walked slowly. He did not turn his back on the chamber. He backed into the crawlway. He crawled out of the chamber backwards, on his belly the way he had come in, watching the chamber the whole way with his helmet lamp. The presence stayed in the chamber. At the mouth of the crawlway on the far side, back in the survey passage, he stood up. He looked back through the crawlway. He could see, at the far end, the edge of the chamber illuminated by his helmet lamp. He could not see the presence, but he could feel that it was there, and he could feel that it was watching him from the chamber, and he could feel that it stayed in the chamber. He turned and walked back through the passage to the bivouac at Station N747. He got to the bivouac at 3:40 in the afternoon. He sat on his bivouac pad. He drank water from his canteen. He ate a bar of the brand of energy bar he carried on cave trips. He thought. He thought about the chamber. He thought about the 7 cairns arranged in a circle. He thought about the tools in the notch in the wall. He thought about the carbon marks on the walls at shoulder height. He thought about the breakdown pile that had sealed the chamber 10,000 years ago, or 12,000 years ago, or however long ago. He thought about the people who had been in the chamber before the breakdown. He thought about how they had died, because they had died in the chamber. There was no exit, no water source, no food. They would have died in a few days. He thought about why they had come. He thought about the presence. He thought about whether the presence had been in the chamber when the people had come, or whether it had come after, or whether it was in some way them, a residue of them, and accumulated something from their final days in the chamber. He thought about whether he could know that. He decided he could not. He thought about what he was going to do. He was, on the reckoning of a cave surveyor of 22 years, and a member in good standing of the National Speleological Society, expected to submit a full survey of any new chamber he entered. He was expected to photograph it. He was expected to note its archaeological content. He was expected, in the case of archaeological content of the kind he had found, to notify the Indiana State Historic Preservation Office within 30 days. He was expected, as a matter of the ethics of cave surveying, to make the discovery known to the community. The find, if reported, would be a significant one. He knew that. There were exactly 2 documented sites in the Americas, with cairns and stone tools of the age suggested by the calcite patinas. Both were in Mexico. Both had been the subject of significant academic work. Neither had been in a sealed chamber. A sealed chamber in southern Indiana, with 7 cairns and 7 late Paleolithic tools would be, on the reckoning of the archaeological community, a discovery of some scale. The published papers on the find would appear in journals within 2 or 3 years of the reporting. There would be an interview or two with Bramwell in the regional press. The Ents would give him an award. The Indiana State Park System would put up an interpretive sign somewhere in the visitor center at Wyandotte. In the longer term, the find would enter the general body of knowledge on the early human presence in the North American continent. If he did that, the archaeological community would descend on the cave within months. The Indiana SPO would put a gate on the entrance to the passage or on the chamber itself. Archaeologists would come in. They would photograph the cairns. They would remove the tools for dating. They would take samples. They would map the chamber. They would publish papers. They would do all of that in the presence of the presence. Bramwell thought about that. He thought about what would happen if the presence did not stay in the chamber. He thought about what would happen if the presence was somehow attached to the seal, to the breakdown pile, to the isolation of the chamber, to the fact of the chamber having been sealed for however many thousand years, and if the presence was somehow loosened by the archaeological work that would open the seal. He thought about what would happen if the presence came out. He did not know what the presence was, but he was aware, on the reckoning of a man who had trusted his cave instincts for 22 years, that the presence was something that had been left alone in a sealed chamber for at least 10,000 years, and that the reason it had been alone for that long was that the chamber had been sealed. He thought about the people who had made the cairns. He thought about whether they had sealed themselves in. He thought about whether the breakdown pile that had sealed the passage had been made by them, whether they had, on some reckoning of their own, gone into the chamber and pulled the rocks down behind themselves to make sure they could not come out again, and to make sure the presence could not come out with them. He thought about that for a long time. He thought that was what had happened. He thought about the 7 cairns arranged in a circle in the center of the chamber. He thought that they might be the graves of the 7 people who had gone in and sealed themselves and had waited to die. He thought about the 7 tools in the notch on the far wall. He thought that they had been the tools of the 7, that the 7 had walked into the chamber with their tools and had laid them down in the notch on the far wall and had pulled the breakdown down behind themselves and had sat in a circle in the center of the chamber and had waited, that the cairns were the graves that each had made for themselves, or that the ones who died later had made for the ones who died earlier, until the last one had no one to make a grave for them and had lain down beside the last cairn. He thought about how long it had taken them to die. He thought that if they had gone in with water and food, maybe a week or 2, if they had gone in with nothing, 3 or 4 days, he thought that they had probably gone in with nothing, that the going in had been the commitment, that the 7 of them had, on some afternoon or morning or evening 10 or 12,000 years ago, walked into this chamber with their tools and had sealed themselves in and had waited to die in the dark. He thought about why. He thought about what could have been in their world so bad that 7 of them had walked into a cave and sealed themselves in with it and had died so that it would be sealed in with them and not with anyone else. He thought about it for a long time. Then he thought, whatever it was, they did it. They sealed it in. For 10,000 years, or 12,000 years, or however long, they held the seal. They did not know I would come. They did not know anyone would come. They did it in the hope, or the faith, or the certainty that the breakdown would hold, and that the chamber would stay sealed, and that the thing they had walked in with would stay in with them, and would not, in the long time, come out. They did it well. They did it for 10,000 years. He sat at the bivouac at station N747 in the northern extension of the Wyandotte Cave system at 3:40 in the afternoon of Tuesday, the 4th of March, 2026, and looked at the glow of his headlamp on the silt of the passage floor and made a decision. He got up. He shouldered his survey pack. He walked back down the passage to the breakdown pile. He crawled through the crawlway. He came into the chamber. He turned off his helmet lamp. He sat down in the dark on the floor of the chamber, at about the position where the crawlway opened into the chamber, with his back to the wall. He said, into the dark, in a quiet voice, I am going to leave. I am going to leave, and I am going to seal the chamber behind me. I am not going to tell anyone about this chamber. I am not going to put it on the map. I am not going to notify the Indiana State Historic Preservation Office. I am not going to publish a paper. I am going to leave, and I am going to leave the 7 of you here with the thing you sealed in with yourselves. And I am going to seal the crawlway behind me so that no one else finds this chamber. I want you to know I understand what you did. I want you to know I am going to help you keep doing it. He waited in the dark. He did not know if anything acknowledged. He did not think, on the reckoning, that acknowledgement was the thing that mattered. He turned his helmet lamp back on. He looked around the chamber. He looked at the 7 cairns. He looked at the 7 tools in the notch on the far wall. He looked at the carbon marks at shoulder height on the north wall. He said, out loud, I am sorry. It took 10,000 years for someone to come in and understand. I am glad it was me. I am going to do this right. He crawled out of the chamber for the last time. At the far end of the crawlway, he stood up. He looked at the crawlway. The crawlway was about 80 feet long. It went through a breakdown pile of loose limestone rocks. On his way in, on Tuesday morning, he had noted that the pile was unstable in places, that a cave surveyor pushing hard against the wrong stones could bring more of it down. He looked at the stones he had noted. He put his pack down. He got out his rock hammer from the pack. He worked for the next 4 hours. He worked carefully. He identified the key stones in the pile, the stones whose removal would trigger further collapse. He tapped them with the rock hammer. He pried at them with a pry bar he kept in his pack for the kind of survey work that required moving stones. He removed enough of the keystones to make the pile go. He worked in the way a man works who has come, over the long afternoon of thinking at the bivouac, to a decision, and who is now committed to the decision, and who is doing the work of the decision the right way, the first time. He worked slowly. He worked precisely. He wore his safety glasses. He wore his gloves. He kept his stance on the balls of his feet, ready to move back if the pile came down. He worked at a distance from the critical stones, so that when the pile went, he would be, on the reckoning, safely clear. At about 7:40 in the evening, on Tuesday the 4th of March, 2026, the breakdown pile at the location he had chosen collapsed. He was, at the moment of the collapse, standing about 20 feet back from the pile on the passage side of the crawlway. He watched the dust settle. The crawlway was gone. The pile now filled the passage floor to the ceiling for a length of about 120 feet. It would not be crawlable. It would not be surveyable. It would require an effort with cave-scale, earth-moving equipment to open. The kind of effort that no one would authorize without a reason. And the reason was in the chamber. And the reason was no longer accessible or known. Bramwell sat on the passage floor for a while. He drank water. He ate another energy bar. He sat in the quiet of the passage, with the glow of his helmet lamp on the silt of the floor, and thought about what he had done. He had, on his reckoning, done the right thing. He had, on his reckoning, completed the work the seven had begun. He was, on the reckoning of the archaeological community he had, in the single afternoon, decided not to tell about this chamber, a criminal, a destroyer of a find of archaeological significance, a violator of the ethics of the caving community, a person who had, on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2026, deliberately destroyed a piece of evidence of the early human presence in the North American continent. He knew that too. He accepted it. He was going to carry that, on the reckoning of a man who had lived his life inside the ethics of the Ines and had, in a single afternoon, chosen to break with those ethics, for a reason he could not tell anyone about. He was going to carry it alone. Then he got up and walked back down the passage to the bivouac. At the bivouac, he packed up his survey equipment. He packed up his survey notes. He looked at the survey notes. The notes for Tuesday's work showed a survey passage extending 320 feet from his last previous station, terminating at an impassable breakdown. He made a note in his log for Tuesday. Passage terminates at N786 in impassable breakdown. Approximately 800 feet of survey completed this trip. Passage is very tight through station N780 and pinches out through breakdown at N786. Recommend no further attempts. That was the note that would go on the map. The chamber would not go on the map. The cairns would not go on the map. The tools would not go on the map. The presence would not go on the map. He would carry them all out with him in his head and no place else. He walked out of the cave. The walk out took about 3.5 hours from the bivouac. It was the walk he had made many times. The passage from station N747 back to the main cave section, through the gate at the back of the tour route, through the dark of the commercial section, with only his helmet lamp, out through the gate at the entrance of the tour cave, and into the small parking lot behind the visitor center. He got out at 11:40 on Tuesday night. The parking lot was empty. The visitor center was dark. The March air was cold, probably in the mid-30s. His breath made a cloud in front of his helmet lamp. There was a slight wind moving through the pines around the parking lot. He stood by his truck for a moment, in the cold and the dark of a March night in the karst country of southern Indiana, and looked up at the stars. He had, on the surface, in the reckoning of a man who had just made a decision he was going to carry for the rest of his life, expected to feel something. He did not feel much. He felt tired. He felt hungry. He felt the small, sore places on his shoulders and hips from the crawlway. He felt the quiet certainty of a man who had done what he had come to do. He did not feel guilty. He did not feel afraid. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the way he felt at the end of any long solo cave trip, which was mostly the way a man feels when he has been alone in the dark for a long time and has come back into the air and the sky and needs to eat something and sleep. He put his pack in the truck. He took off his coveralls and boots and cave suit and packed them in the plastic bin in the truck bed he kept for cave gear. He changed into dry clothes. He got into the cab. He started the truck. The heater came on. He sat for a minute with the heater warming up. Then he pulled out of the parking lot and onto the county road that led north to the state highway. The drive home to Bloomington took about 80 minutes. He drove through the small towns of Corydon and Palmyra and Salem in the dark of the middle of the night. The towns were asleep. There were street lights at the intersections, and there were lights on in a few houses where people were up late, and there was the dark of the rural country between the towns. The moon was up, about a half moon, high in the western sky. The pastures on either side of the highway were silver in the moonlight. He thought about the chamber. He thought about the 7 cairns. He thought about the presence. He thought about whether he had done the right thing. He thought about it for the 80 minutes of the drive. He came to the same conclusion several times that he had come to at the bivouac. He had done the right thing. The seven had made their choice 10,000 years ago and had held to it in the way seven people can hold to a thing. And he had, in a single afternoon, understood their choice and had helped them keep it. That was the work that had been asked of him. It had come, in the way work sometimes comes, without warning and without notice and without any way of preparing for it. But it had come, and he had done it. That did not mean it would be easy to carry. He knew that too. He got home at 1:15 in the morning of Wednesday. His wife, Odette, was asleep. He did not wake her. He showered. The hot water ran on his sore shoulders and the small scrape on the back of his left calf, where he had caught it on a rock in the crawlway on the way out. He stood under the water for a long time. He did not think about anything in the shower. He just stood. Then he got out and dried off and put on his sleeping clothes and got into bed. Odette rolled over sleepily and put a hand on his chest. She said, "You're home." He said, "I'm home." She said, "How was it?" He said, "It was good." Long, the passage played out. "I got about 800 feet of survey." She said, "Anything interesting?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Not really. Some flowstone, some helictites, a breakdown that came down on the way out. I got clear before it did." She said, "You got clear." He said, "I did." She said, "Bramwell." He said, "Yes." She said, "Don't scare me like that." He said, "I'm sorry, Odette. It was fine. I was well back when the pile went." She said, "Okay." She kissed his shoulder. She went back to sleep. He lay in the dark beside her. He did not sleep for a while. He listened to Odette's breathing. He listened to the small sounds of the house, the refrigerator in the kitchen, the furnace coming on and going off, the settle of the old floorboards. He thought about the chamber. He thought about the presence. He thought that the presence was still there, right now, in the dark of the chamber under the karst country of southern Indiana, on the other side of the breakdown pile he had dropped that afternoon. He thought that it would be there tomorrow. He thought that it would be there in a year, in 10 years, in 100 years, in 10,000 more years. He thought that no one would go in. He thought that he had done what needed to be done. He turned on his side. He put his arm around Odette. She murmured something in her sleep. He slept. In the morning, he wrote up the survey. He submitted it to the Ents. He noted that the passage had terminated at N786 in impassable breakdown, and that no further pushing was recommended. The Ents accepted the survey. The map was updated. The passage now showed a terminal point at station N786. Kester called him that afternoon. Kester said, Bramwell said, Kester said, "I saw your report. You closed the passage." Bramwell said, "It closed itself. The breakdown came down when I was in the crawlway. I got out. The passage is gone now. I got about 800 feet of survey." Kester was quiet for a moment. Kester said, "You crawled through a breakdown that came down on you." Bramwell said, "I got out." Kester said, "Bramwell, are you all right?" Bramwell said, "I am all right. It was a tight one, but I got out." The passage was not worth further pushing. It was pinching down anyway. Kester said, "I saw." Bramwell said, "I'm sorry, Kester. It looked like it might go somewhere. It didn't." Kester said, "That happens sometimes." Bramwell said, "Yes, it does." Kester said, "Bramwell, are you sure you're all right?" Bramwell said, "I am, Kester, really. I'm home. I'm going to take a few days." Kester said, "Take them. Call me if you want to talk." Bramwell said, "I will." Bramwell did not call her. He continued to be a member of the NS. He continued to do cave surveys. He did the wind-out system 3 more times in the next 2 years. but he never went to the northern extension again. He recommended that other surveyors not go there either. He said the northern extension had been played out. He said the passages beyond N786 were too tight and unstable to be worth further work. Other surveyors listened to him. Bramwell had a reputation for a good read on cave passages. His recommendation was taken. The northern extension was not surveyed further. Bramwell continued in the NSYS for another 18 years. He retired at 65. He never told anyone about the chamber, not his wife Odette, who was a librarian at the University Library in Bloomington and who did not know what caves he had been in on any particular trip. Not his son Wren, who was a music teacher in Cincinnati and who did not know anything about caves. Not his closest friend in the NSYS, Kester Baum, who had been his surveying partner on many trips outside Wyandotte and who would have understood. Not the Indiana SPO, not the archaeological community, not any archaeological journal, not anyone. He carried the chamber alone. Sometimes at night in bed beside Odette, he would lie awake and think about the chamber. He would think about the 7 cairns arranged in a circle. He would think about the tools in the notch in the wall. He would think about the carbon marks at shoulder height on the walls. He would think about the seal. He would think about the presence. He would think about the 7 people who had gone into the chamber and pulled the rocks down behind themselves and had died there so that the presence would not come out with them. He would think about the 10 or 12,000 years that had passed since they had done that. He would think about how he had, on a Tuesday in March of 2026, opened the seal by crawling through it, and had then closed it again by dropping the breakdown pile on the far side, and had done both those things in one day, and had left the seal closed. He would think about the presence that had been in the chamber when he had turned off his headlamp, about how it had been watching him, about how it had stayed in the chamber when he had left. He would think that it was still there, that it was in the chamber, that the seal was holding, that whatever the 7 had done, whatever they had known that Bramwell would never know, was still doing its work in a chamber in the northern extension of the Wyandotte Cave system in southern Indiana that was not on any map. He would think that he had helped them, that he had inherited the seal from them, that the reason he had lived his life in caves, that the reason he had spent 22 years surveying, learning to read cave passages, learning to trust his instincts about the state of a chamber, learning to work with rock and dust and dark, was so that he could, on one Tuesday in March of 2026, walk into the chamber and understand what they had done and complete it. He would think that. Then he would sleep. He would sleep on the reckoning of a man who had helped 7 strangers hold a seal against something for another 10,000 years. Well, he would dream of Odette. He would dream of Wren. He would dream of the caves he had loved. He would not dream of the chamber. The chamber was sealed. He had done what needed to be done. He would sleep the sleep of a man who had done work, and he would wake in the morning to have coffee with his wife, and he would live the rest of his life. That was the work. He had done it well.